"She is nothing compared to a woman like my mother," my daughter-in-law said loud enough for the entire dining room to hear. She pushed her plate of my homemade food away with a look of absolute disgust. I did not yell. I did not throw her out. I simply picked up my linen napkin, wiped my mouth, and looked her dead in the eye. "Then maybe your mother should start paying your rent," I said. The room went completely silent. My son froze his fork halfway to his mouth. "Rent?" My daughter-in-law laughed, though her voice trembled. "What rent? We own that penthouse." She looked at her husband for confirmation, but the sweat pouring down his forehead told her everything she needed to know. "My name is Vivian. I am 58 years old, and for decades I broke my back to build an empire so my family would never have to struggle. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that respect in a family is earned and not just freely given. If you have ever had to put an entitled relative in their place, you will want to hear exactly how this Sunday dinner ended, because the truth always comes out eventually. Growing up on the south side of Atlanta, I learned early on that nobody was going to hand me a single thing in this world. I started with a single food truck, waking up at 3 in the morning to prep ingredients while my husband worked double shifts. Together, we turned that one truck into a regional chain of high-end soul food restaurants and a massive portfolio of commercial real estate. When my husband passed away 10 years ago, I promised him I would protect our legacy and protect our only son, Marcus. I made sure Marcus never knew the feeling of an empty stomach or a past-due light bill. I paid for his expensive private schools, his college tuition out of state, and his first luxury car. I thought I was giving him a solid head start in life. Instead, I was raising a man who would eventually mistake my generosity for weakness and my quiet nature for ignorance. Marcus is 32 years old now and married to Chloe. Chloe is a 29-year-old white woman who comes from a family that loves to portray old money wealth. Her mother, Susan, acts like she descended from royalty, constantly looking down her nose at what she calls my loud and unsophisticated lifestyle. Susan wears pearls to the grocery store and speaks with a fake transatlantic accent, but I always knew something about her spirit felt cheap. I always tolerated their subtle disrespect and their microaggressions for the sake of my son. I believed in keeping the peace. I believed in the sacred tradition of Sunday dinners, where family comes together to break bread and express gratitude. It was the third Sunday of the month, which meant it was my turn to host the family dinner at my estate. I had spent 2 entire days preparing the meal. In my culture, this was not just food, it was heritage on a plate. I had slow-roasted a crown roast of pork, prepared my grandmother us famous baked macaroni and cheese, braised collard greens with smoked turkey tails, and baked a peach cobbler completely from scratch. My dining room table was set with my finest china and crystal glasses. I wanted everything to be perfect and welcoming. My older sister Denise was there, of course. Denise is 60 years old and has always harbored a deep-seated jealousy of my success. She sat at the table sipping her expensive wine, ready to agree with any insult thrown my way just to make herself feel superior. Denise has spent her entire life trying to act like a high society socialite on a civil service salary. Then there was Marcus and Chloe. They arrived 45 minutes late without so much as a basic apology for keeping everyone waiting. Chloe walked into my foyer wearing a silk designer dress, carrying a tiny handbag, and complaining loudly about how the Atlanta humidity was ruining her expensive blowout. As soon as we sat down to eat, the tension in the room was palpable. I passed the heavy serving dishes around the mahogany table, offering everyone the first portions. When the macaroni and cheese reached Chloe, she wrinkled her nose as if she had just been handed a plate of absolute garbage. She took the tiniest spoonful and placed it on the far edge of her plate, miles away from her salad. I saw it, but I ignored it. I turned to my son and asked Marcus how his new marketing consulting firm was doing. Marcus puffed up his chest and started talking loudly about his big corporate clients and his supposed 6-figure deals. He sounded exactly like a man who was trying entirely too hard to convince himself of his own success. He talked about his leased foreign cars and his tailored suits. Chloe smiled proudly and patted his hand as if he were a prize-winning horse. "My husband is doing incredibly well," she announced to the table, lifting her chin. We are actually looking at buying a vacation home in the Hamptons next summer. We just need a place to escape the southern heat. I took a slow sip of my iced tea, letting the cool liquid soothe my throat. I knew for an absolute fact that Marcus was struggling to keep his doors open. I knew because I was the one secretly keeping his business afloat by throwing large corporate catering contracts his way and paying his invoices early. But I did not say a single word. I let him have his moment of pride in front of his wife and his aunt. But Chloe could not just leave it at that. She needed to make sure everyone in the room knew that she felt entirely superior to us and our traditions. She pushed her plate away, the food barely touched. "You know, Vivian," she said, wiping her mouth with a dramatic sigh, "this food is just so heavy and greasy. My mother, Susan, has a private chef who prepares light Mediterranean meals for us when we visit. It is just so much more refined for the palate. I feel like all this butter and salt is just terrible for your heart. You really should ask my mother for some dietary advice the next time you see her." Denise chuckled from across the table, taking a large, unapologetic bite of her greens. "Oh, you know Vivian loves her heavy country cooking," Denise chimed in, eager to join the ridicule. "She has always been a bit stubborn about learning new, sophisticated ways. She is set in her old ways." I kept my face perfectly still. I looked at Marcus, expecting him to defend me. I expected him to tell his wife that you do not come into a black mother U.S. house, sit at her dining table, and disrespect the food she spent 2 entire days preparing with love. I expected him to be a man and demand respect for his mother. But Marcus just looked down at his plate, suddenly very interested in his roasted pork, refusing to make eye contact with me. Chloe took his cowardly silence as encouragement to push further. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms and looking around my elegantly decorated dining room with a look of pure pity. "In fact, Vivian," she continued, her voice dripping with extreme condescension, "my mother is coming into town next week. She is staying at the luxury penthouse she bought for us in Midtown. You really should come over and see how she decorated it. She has such an incredible eye for high-end real estate and true luxury. She really is a masterclass in elegance and grace. It is just a terrible shame you never had a mentor like her to show you how to truly handle wealth without looking so new money. She is just on a completely different level. She is nothing compared to a woman like my mother." The silence in my dining room was so heavy you could cut it with a butter knife. Denise stopped chewing her food. Even the antique grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to tick louder in the dead quiet. I looked at Chloe. I looked at her smug, entitled face and her complete lack of home training. And then I looked at my son, the son I had sacrificed my youth and my energy for, the son who was happily sitting there letting a woman disrespect my home, my culture, and my entire life, us work. I reached for my linen napkin. I deliberately unfolded it, dabbed the corners of my mouth, and placed it neatly next to my plate. I rested my forearms on the heavy table and leaned forward just an inch, closing the distance between us. "Then maybe your mother should start paying your rent," I said. My voice was calm, quiet, and absolutely lethal. I did not need to raise my voice to command the room. Chloe let out a short, confused little laugh. "Rent," she repeated as if I had spoken a completely foreign language. "What rent?" "We do not pay rent, Vivian. We own that penthouse. My mother bought it for us outright as a wedding gift." I did not break eye contact with her for a single second. "Is that what Marcus told you?" I asked smoothly. Chloe whipped her head to look at her husband. Marcus had completely stopped breathing. His skin had turned a concerning shade of gray, and large beads of sweat were forming rapidly on his upper lip. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a massive truck. "Marcus," Chloe said, her voice suddenly rising in pitch and panic. "What is she talking about right now? Tell her she is crazy. Tell her my mother bought our house. Tell her." Marcus opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked absolutely terrified. He looked exactly like a little boy who had just been caught stealing from the church collection plate. I sat back in my chair, picking up my glass of iced tea. "You see, Chloe," I said, the ice clinking softly against the crystal glass, "your mother did not buy that penthouse. My corporate real estate holding company owns that penthouse. I bought it 3 years ago as an investment property. I let Marcus move in under the strict legal agreement that he pays the monthly homeowners association fees and a heavily discounted rent of $2,000 a month. A rent, by the way, that he is currently 6 full months behind on. Chloe's jaw dropped open. The color completely drained from her face, making her look ghostly pale. She looked back and forth between me and Marcus, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. But my mother gave you $500,000 in cash for the closing," she stammered, her voice now shaking uncontrollably. I watched him put the cashier's check in his briefcase with my own 2 eyes. "Where did that money go, Marcus?" I slowly lowered my glass back onto the table. Now that was a piece of information I did not have. $500,000. I looked at Marcus, my mind racing. My son was staring at the hardwood floor, gripping the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles were turning bright white. He was visibly shaking. The air in the room suddenly grew incredibly cold. The web of lies was unraveling right over the macaroni and cheese. And looking at the sheer terror in my son's eyes, I knew with absolute certainty that this was only the very beginning of the nightmare. The silence in my dining room was absolute and suffocating. You could hear the ice melting in the crystal glasses and the heavy ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. Chloe stared at Marcus, waiting for him to tell her that I was a bitter old woman making up vicious lies to ruin their perfect evening. But Marcus could not even look at her. He kept his eyes glued to the half-eaten roasted pork on his plate, as if it held the secrets to the universe. His chest was heaving under his tailored suit jacket, and a single drop of sweat rolled down his temple. I watched my son, the boy I had raised with everything I had, crumble into a coward right before my eyes. Chloe turned back to me, her fake aristocratic confidence completely shattered. She placed her hands flat on the mahogany table, her knuckles turning white from the pressure. "What do you mean your company owns it?" she asked, her voice dropping an octave into a nervous whisper. "My mother bought that property. She wired the funds to Marcus for the closing. You are lying. You are just jealous that my family has real money and you are trying to embarrass us." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to scream to command the room. I reached into the leather binder I always keep on the sideboard, where I manage my household accounts. I pulled out a crisp manila folder and slid it across the smooth wood right until it hit the edge of her expensive dinner plate. "I do not need to lie about real estate," I said smoothly, taking another sip of my iced tea. "Open it. Go ahead and look at the deed, Chloe." The property is registered to Southside Holdings, which is a limited liability company fully owned and operated by me. I purchased that luxury penthouse 3 years ago when the market dipped because I know a good investment when I see one. When Marcus told me he was marrying you and wanted to provide a lifestyle he could not actually afford on his own, he came begging to me. He asked to move into the empty unit so he could look like a big shot for your family. I agreed because he is my only son, and a mother always wants to help her child. But I raised him to be a man, not a charity case relying on his mother to fund his delusions of grandeur. I told him he could live there rent-free, but he was entirely responsible for the $2,000 monthly homeowners association fees. It was a test of his responsibility as a husband and a provider. A test he has miserably failed. He has not paid a single dime to the building association in 6 full months. The management company sent the final warning notice directly to my office last Tuesday because my name is on the deed. I was planning to discuss this with him privately after dinner, but since you wanted to insult my food and praise your mother and her supposed wealth, I figured we could lay all the real facts on the table right now. Chloe opened the folder with violently shaking hands. Her eyes scanned the legal documents, the embossed state stamps, and the highlighted final eviction notice from the building management. I watched the horrible realization wash over her pale face. Every single thing she had been bragging about to her country club friends, every photo she posted, pretending to be a wealthy young wife, was built on a foundation of my money and my son and his web of deceit. She looked physically sick. Before Chloe could even form another sentence, my older sister Denise decided she needed to insert herself into the drama, as she always does. Denise slammed her wine glass down on the table, spilling expensive red wine onto my pristine white tablecloth. "Vivian, you are completely out of line." Denise snapped, her voice shrill and extremely defensive. "How can you sit there and embarrass your own flesh and blood in front of his new wife? You have millions of dollars sitting in the bank right now. You own half the commercial properties in this entire zip code, and you are going to harass this young couple over a few $1,000s in association fees. You have always been greedy, Vivian, always holding your money over everyone just to make yourself feel powerful and important." I turned my gaze slowly to my sister, letting her feel the full weight of my annoyance. Denise had always despised my success because it highlighted her own failures and her inability to manage her life. "Denise," I said, my tone dropping to a dangerous whisper that made her flinch. "You are sitting at my dining table drinking my expensive wine and eating the food I spent 2 days paying for and cooking. Do not ever speak to me about greed. When the bank was about to foreclose on your townhouse 5 years ago, who wrote the check to save you from being homeless? When you wanted to act like a big shot and host a lavish graduation party for your daughter who catered the entire event for free, it was me. I have carried this family on my back for decades, so unless you are pulling out your own personal checkbook right now to cover your nephew and his debts, I suggest you pick up your fork and finish your macaroni and cheese in absolute silence." Denise opened her mouth to argue, but the cold look in my eyes made her snap her jaw shut immediately. She crossed her arms over her chest and looked away, fuming with anger, but completely defeated by the truth. With Denise properly silenced, the attention of the room returned to the golden couple sitting across from me. Marcus finally found a tiny shred of courage somewhere in his chest. He reached out with a trembling hand to touch his wife on her arm. "Chloe, baby, please let me explain," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. He looked incredibly pathetic sitting there in his expensive suit with no money to back it up. "Do not touch me!" Chloe shrieked violently, yanking her arm away from him, as if his touch burned her skin. She stood up so fast, her heavy wooden dining chair tipped backward and crashed onto the hardwood floor. The loud bang echoed through the large house, but nobody moved to pick the chair up. Chloe was shaking from head to toe. Her face was flushed with a toxic mixture of profound embarrassment and pure, uncontrolled rage. "You lied to me!" she screamed at him, pointing a trembling finger in his face. "You let me walk around for 2 entire years thinking we owned that place. You let me brag to my friends about our real estate portfolio. You let my mother think she secured our future when she gave you that money. You are nothing but a broke liar playing dress-up with your mommy and her money." Marcus stood up quickly, reaching for her again, tears welling up in his eyes. "Chloe, please, we can fix this," he begged. "We just need a little time to sort out the finances. I did not want you to leave me. I wanted to give you the life you deserved." Before he could finish his pathetic excuse, Chloe raised her hand and slapped him directly across the face with all her might. The sound of her palm striking his cheek was as sharp as a gunshot in the quiet room. Marcus stumbled back, holding his red face completely stunned by the physical blow. I sat perfectly still watching the scene unfold. I do not tolerate violence in my home under any circumstances, but at that very moment I felt that Marcus deserved every bit of that slap for the humiliation he brought upon himself. I thought the drama was finally over. I thought the worst secrets had been exposed, and the false image of their perfect marriage was successfully shattered for good. I expected Chloe to storm out of the house, grab her designer purse, and run crying to her car to drive back to her mother. But Chloe did not move toward the front door. She did not cry. Instead, she slowly turned her head away from Marcus and looked directly at me. The hot anger in her eyes was suddenly replaced by a cold, calculating confusion. She walked slowly toward the head of the table where I was sitting, taking deep breaths to steady herself. "If your company owns the penthouse, Vivian," she said, her voice trembling, but unnervingly focused on me, "and if Marcus has only been paying homeowners' fees this whole time, then where is the rest of the money?" I furrowed my brow, genuinely confused by her question. "What money are you talking about, Chloe?" I asked, looking at her pale face. She leaned over the table, placing her hands right next to my plate of cold food, her eyes wide with panic. "The $500,000, she screamed, her voice tearing through the dining room and bouncing off the walls. My mother gave him $500,000 in cash to buy this place outright. I watched him put the cashier check in his briefcase with my own 2 eyes on our wedding day. Where did that money go, Marcus? I felt all the warm blood drain from my face in an instant. My heart stopped beating for a full second as her words hit me like a physical blow. I looked over at Marcus, who was now openly weeping near the fallen chair, holding his face and refusing to look at either of us. I froze, completely rooted to my chair. I managed a multi-million-dollar empire. I knew every single penny that came in and out of my family accounts. I tracked every investment, every loan, and every gift. And I knew absolutely nothing about $500,000. The room started to spin slightly as a dark, terrifying realization began to form in my mind. If Susan gave him that much money and it did not go to the house, then what kind of terrible trouble was my son really in? The morning after the disastrous Sunday dinner, I arrived at my restaurant office before the sun even came up. My mind was still racing from the chaotic events of the previous night. The image of my son Marcus, looking completely terrified, kept playing on a continuous loop in my head. I sat at my large mahogany desk, reviewing the weekly inventory reports, but I could barely focus on the numbers. I knew Chloe would inevitably run crying to her mother. Susan. I knew it was only a matter of time before Susan tried to intervene in this family crisis now. Sure enough, at exactly 10 in the morning, the heavy glass door to my private office swung open without a single knock. Susan barged into my sanctuary, walking as if she owned the entire building. She was wearing a loud floral dress that looked incredibly out of place for a Monday morning in Atlanta. She clutched a large, heavily branded designer handbag tightly against her chest like a shield. Her face was completely red with fake righteous anger. She did not bother to say good morning or offer any basic greeting before she started making her loud, ridiculous demands. "Vivian, what on earth is wrong with you?" Susan yelled, her voice echoing off the brick walls of my office. "Chloe called me last night, completely hysterical because of your cruel behavior. She told me you are trying to kick them out of their own home over a few unpaid bills." I put down my pen slowly and looked at her. I did not invite her to sit down. I did not offer her a glass of water. I just let her stand there in the center of the room, looking entirely foolish and completely out of her depth. "You have absolutely no right to treat my daughter this way," Susan continued, pointing her manicured finger at me. "She is a delicate young woman, and she is accustomed to a certain standard of living. I gave Marcus $500,000 of my own hard-earned money to purchase that penthouse for them. If your little company somehow managed to get its name on the deed, then you are legally obligated to sign it over to Chloe immediately. You are stealing from your own children, Vivian, and it is honestly the most disgusting thing I have ever witnessed." I leaned back in my leather chair, crossing my arms over my chest. The sheer audacity of this woman standing in my office telling me how to handle my property was almost laughable. "Susan, you are standing in a building that I own," I said quietly. "You are breathing air that I pay to condition. You need to lower your voice immediately." Susan scoffed and rolled her eyes, throwing her fake designer bag onto one of my guest chairs. She reached into her pocket and aggressively pulled out a small rectangular piece of paper, slamming it onto my desk with great force. "Today, I am not here to argue with you about your little restaurants, Vivian," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "I know you people struggle with finances, and maybe you are just desperate for cash right now. So I am going to do you a massive favor. I am going to help you out, because I am a generous person. That is a cashier check for $10,000. Consider it a charitable donation to your little business. Now take the money and sign the penthouse deed over to Chloe today before I involve my lawyers." I looked down at the check sitting on my pristine desk. $10,000. She honestly thought she could buy my dignity and my multi-million-dollar property with a $10,000 bribe disguised as charity. I looked back up at Susan. She had a smug, victorious smile plastered across her face. She truly believed she was a wealthy savior, rescuing her poor, uneducated in-laws from financial ruin. She believed she held all the power in this room. I slowly reached out and picked up the piece of paper, holding it gently between my 2 fingers. I looked at the amount written on the paper, and then I looked directly into her eyes. I did not say a single word as I smoothly turned my body to my right, where my heavy-duty paper shredder was sitting perfectly ready for use. On the wooden floor beside my office desk today, I pressed the power button, and the machine whirred to life with a low, steady hum, maintaining absolute direct eye contact with Susan. I slowly fed her $10,000 check right into the teeth of the shredder. The machine ate the paper in less than 2 seconds, destroying her little bribe completely. Susan gasped loudly, clutching her chest in shock. "Are you completely insane?" Susan shrieked, stepping back as if I had just physically attacked her. "That was $10,000, you ungrateful woman." I turned the shredder off and calmly folded my hands on my desk. "I do not need your charity, Susan," I said, my voice dangerously low and smooth, "and I certainly do not need financial advice from a woman carrying a fake luxury handbag." Susan froze completely. Her hand instinctively reached out to touch the bag she had thrown on my chair. "How dare you?" she sputtered, her face turning an ugly shade of purple. "Do not insult my intelligence." I continued, refusing to let her interrupt me. "The stitching on that handle is entirely uneven, and the hardware is made of cheap plastic painted gold. The monogram pattern does not even align on the bottom seam. You parade around my city acting like you come from generations of old money, but real wealth does not need to scream for constant attention. Real wealth does not buy cheap knockoffs from the trunk of a car anywhere in this entire metropolitan area today." Susan glared fiercely. "And real wealth certainly does not try to buy a luxury penthouse in Midtown Atlanta with a $10,000 check." Susan was physically shaking with rage and deep humiliation. She grabbed her fake bag off the chair, hugging it to her body as if it could protect her from the brutal truth. "You will regret this, Vivian," she hissed, her voice trembling. "I gave Marcus $500,000. I will call the police and tell them you stole my money. I will have you investigated for fraud. I am going to ruin you and your little food business." I smiled, a cold, empty smile. "Go ahead and call them, Susan," I challenged her. "Let us see exactly what happens when they look into your background." Susan turned around and stormed out of my office, slamming the heavy glass door so hard I thought it might shatter into tiny pieces. I watched her stomp through the empty restaurant dining room, completely frantic and out of control. Once she was finally out of sight, my cold smile completely vanished. The encounter with Susan only confirmed my deepest fears. She was desperate, and she was absolutely convinced she had handed over a massive amount of cash to my son. I picked up my office phone and quickly dialed the direct line to my personal banker at the downtown financial firm. I needed answers, and I needed them right now, without any more delays or stupid lies from my son this morning. "Good morning, Vivian." My banker Thomas answered after the very first ring. "It is always a pleasure to hear from you. How can I help you today?" "Thomas, I need you to do an immediate deep dive into Marcus and his accounts," I said, skipping all the pleasantries. "I need to know about a specific transaction that supposedly happened 2 years ago, right before he got married. Someone claims they wired him $500,000 in cash for a real estate closing. I need to know exactly where that money came from and exactly which account it was deposited into." I waited on the line while Thomas typed rapidly on his keyboard. The seconds felt like hours. The silence in my office was heavy and suffocating. My heart beat loudly in my chest. I prayed that Susan was just lying. I prayed that Marcus had simply taken out a bad loan. But deep down in my spirit, I knew the truth was going to be so much worse. Vivian, Thomas finally said, his voice sounding incredibly serious and quiet. "I am looking at the transfer records from that exact time period right now, and there is a massive problem." "What is it, Thomas?" I asked, gripping the phone tightly. He paused for a moment before delivering the fatal blow. "The $500,000 did not come from Susan or any external account," Thomas explained. "It was drained from the secure private retirement pension fund through Marcus, forging signatures." I left my office immediately after my banker Thomas delivered the devastating news. The air in my car felt thick and unbreathable as I drove across Atlanta to find my son. I did not bother calling him because I knew he would just screen my call and hide like a coward. I drove straight to the shared workspace building where he rented a tiny glass cubicle for his fake marketing firm. He liked to pretend he was running a massive corporation, but the reality was just a sad illusion. I walked past the receptionist without stopping today in the morning. I found Marcus sitting at his small desk, staring blankly at a computer screen. He looked up and all the color drained from his face when he saw me standing in his doorway. I stepped inside the office and closed the door firmly behind me. I pulled down the blinds so none of the other entrepreneurs could see the destruction that was about to happen. Marcus stood up slowly, gripping the edge of his desk. His hands were shaking, just like they were at the dinner table the night before. "Mom," he said in a very quiet and terrified voice. I held up my hand to silence him before he could utter another useless lie. "I do not want to hear a single word out of your mouth until I am finished speaking." I said, my voice low and completely devoid of any maternal warmth. "I just got off the phone with Thomas at the bank, and he told me exactly where you got the $500,000. You did not get a dime from Susan and her fake luxury lifestyle. You committed federal fraud. You forged signatures to drain the private retirement pension fund of your father completely." The mention of his dead father was the final blow that completely shattered his fragile composure. Marcus collapsed back into his cheap office chair and buried his face in his hands. A loud, ugly sob tore out of his chest, and he began to weep uncontrollably. The tears flowed down his face, ruining his carefully groomed image. I stood there looking at a grown man crying like a helpless toddler. I felt absolutely nothing for him in that moment. No pity and no desire to comfort him. "Mom, please, you have to understand," he wailed loudly through his wet tears. "I was drowning," he sobbed, wiping his wet face with the sleeve of his expensive suit. "Chloe expects so much from me, and her mother is constantly judging every single move I make." Susan kept making comments about how my background was not good enough for her daughter. They wanted a country club lifestyle, and my business was failing. I needed the cash to buy that penthouse to prove I was worthy of marrying into their family. I was going to put the money back. I swear I was going to return every single penny very soon to you today. "You stole from the legacy your father worked his entire life to build," I said, my tone colder than ice. "You traded the security of your own family just to impress a white woman who looks down on our culture and her mother who carries fake designer bags. You wanted to play the role of a rich man so badly that you became a common thief. You sacrificed your own flesh and blood for the approval of absolute strangers. Do not sit there and cry to me about the heavy pressure of your own stupid and shallow choices right now." Marcus continued to cry, begging for my forgiveness. He reached out to grab my hand, but I quickly stepped back, refusing to let him touch me. "Mom, please help me fix this," he pleaded desperately. "If Chloe finds out the truth, she will divorce me and take everything. If Susan finds out, she will destroy my reputation in this city. You have always protected me. You have always fixed my mistakes. Please, just let this slide, and I promise I will work for the rest of my life to pay you back. I just need a little more time, Mother." I opened my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick legal document that my lawyer Valerie had drafted earlier that morning. I slapped the stack of papers down on his desk right next to his keyboard. "There will be no sliding, and there will be no fixing this behind closed doors," I said, pointing a firm finger at the document. "This is a full confession and a legal repayment agreement. It states that you stole $500,000, and you agree to surrender all your personal assets to my holding company until the entire debt is cleared completely today." Marcus stared at the legal documents as if they were covered in venomous snakes. "You want me to sign away my cars and my bank accounts?" he asked, his voice trembling with a new kind of fear. "If I sign this, I will be completely bankrupt. Chloe will leave me immediately. I will have absolutely nothing left to my name." I crossed my arms and looked down at him without a single ounce of sympathy. "You already have nothing," I reminded him brutally. "You built a fake life using stolen money. Now you have a very simple choice right here. You either sign those legal papers right now and agree to pay back every single dime you stole from your father, or I walk out of this office and drive straight to the federal authorities," I told him. I will hand over the forged bank transfers to the police, and I will watch them arrest you for grand larceny and wire fraud. You will not just lose your arrogant white wife and your fake country club membership. You will lose your freedom, and you will spend the next 10 years sitting inside a federal prison cell, completely alone, starting today." The air in the room grew completely still as the reality of my threat washed over him. He looked up into my eyes, searching for any sign of bluffing or weakness. He searched for the mother who used to coddle him and protect him from the harsh consequences of the real world, but he found absolutely nothing. I was a businesswoman who had survived the hardest streets of Atlanta, and I was not going to let a weak man destroy my empire, even if I gave birth to him. "Sign the legal paper, Marcus," I demanded once again right now. I watched a profound change happen within my son in that exact moment. The frantic energy and the pathetic weeping completely stopped. He slowly lowered his hands from his wet face and wiped his cheeks with the back of his sleeve. His shoulders straightened, and the terrified little boy vanished, replaced by a cold and bitter stranger. The panic in his eyes faded away, and a dark, hardened expression settled over his features. He looked at the legal documents on his desk and then pushed them away, letting them scatter across the floor in a very messy pile right away. "I am not signing anything," he said, his voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. I blinked, slightly surprised by his sudden shift in tone. "You think you hold all the cards just because you have the bank on your side?" He continued, standing up from his chair. "You think you can just come in here and threaten me like I am one of your stupid employees? You have always used your money to control me. You gave me everything just so you could hold it over my head whenever I did something you did not like at all. I am sick and tired of living in your shadow," Marcus sneered, stepping closer to me. "I am tired of you thinking you are the only one in this family who knows how to build real wealth. You look down on Chloe and Susan because they actually know how to live a life of luxury, while you still act like a poor woman from the South Side. You think you can strip me of my dignity and send me to prison. But you are far too late, Mom. You do not ever own me or my future anymore at all." He reached into his own desk drawer and pulled out a different folder, tossing it onto the table between us. I looked down at the paper and saw the official seal of the state business registry. Aunt Denise helped me transfer the legal operating rights of the entire restaurant chain into my name. "Last month," Marcus said, a cruel smile spreading across his face, "we used the old family accountant credentials to bypass your security checks. You can keep your little penthouse because the restaurant empire belongs to me now. Go ahead and call the local police if you dare." It had been exactly 3 days since my son declared war against me. I spent those days immersed in my sanctuary. My home was my fortress, built from the ground up with money I earned through decades of backbreaking work. I sat in my sunroom sipping chamomile tea, looking out over my garden. My lawyer, Valerie, had already initiated legal audits to trap my sister Denise and Marcus in their own fraudulent schemes. I knew the storm was coming, but I was perfectly content waiting in the calm center of it. I walked slowly through the long hallway toward the grand foyer. When I opened the heavy oak front door, I found my son Marcus and his wife Chloe standing on my front porch. I stood perfectly still in the doorway, refusing to step aside. The aggressive, arrogant energy they displayed just a few days ago was completely gone. In its place was a carefully constructed image of absolute humility and desperation. Chloe was not wearing her usual tight designer clothes or towering high heels. Instead, she wore a loose-fitting pastel sweater and flat, sensible shoes. She looked entirely different from the condescending woman who had insulted my cooking at my Sunday dinner table. Marcus stood beside her, looking down at his expensive shoes, with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked like a beaten dog returning to the porch to beg for scraps. "Mom," he said, his voice soft and trembling. I stared at him for a long, silent moment. I knew this was a performance. I knew they only showed up when their terrible plans started falling apart. But my curiosity outweighed my desire to slam the door in their faces. I stepped back silently and opened the door wider, allowing them to step into the grand foyer. I did not invite them into my living room. I made them stand on the cold marble floor of the entryway. I crossed my arms over my chest and waited for the show to begin. "We are listening," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any warmth. Marcus nervously cleared his throat and took a step forward. "Mom, I am so incredibly sorry for the things I said to you." he began, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. I was angry and terrified of losing everything. I let my pride get the best of me. You are my mother, and I love you. I watched his mouth moving, but I felt absolutely nothing in my heart. He was reciting lines like a terrible actor in a cheap daytime soap opera. Chloe stepped forward and placed her hand gently on his arm, looking up at me with wide, innocent eyes. "Vivian, we are both so deeply sorry," she whispered, her voice shaking just enough to sound authentic. "I know I have been disrespectful to you and to your beautiful culture. I know I have acted like a spoiled brat who takes everything for granted. My mother raised me to care about status and wealth, but Marcus taught me what real family looks like. We have been completely miserable for the past 3 days." I stood there observing her body language, the way she leaned into Marcus, the way she kept her eyes wide and pleading, the way her voice cracked on cue. It was honestly a masterclass in manipulation. If I were a weaker woman, I might have fallen for it entirely. But I was Vivian. I saw right through the cheap plastic mask she was wearing. I remained completely silent, forcing them to sit in the uncomfortable tension of their own lies. When Chloe realized that her fake tears were not melting my icy exterior, she decided it was time to play her ultimate trump card. She let out a soft, trembling sigh and slowly moved her hand down. She gently rubbed her stomach in a slow, circular motion, looking down at it with a fake expression of pure maternal wonder. Then she looked back up at me, with fresh tears welling in her eyes. "Vivian, we did not just come here to apologize for ourselves," Chloe said softly, letting a single tear roll down her pale cheek. "We came here because we have some incredibly beautiful news. We are going to have a baby. I am pregnant. We just found out 2 days ago." I watched her hand moving over her flat stomach. The classic baby trap. When you cannot secure the bag with your charm, you try to secure it with a child. Marcus nodded quickly, stepping closer to her and wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Mom, you are going to be a grandmother," he said, smiling a weak, desperate smile. "This changes absolutely everything for us. We want our child to know you. Please, Mom, for the sake of the baby, can we please just bury the hatchet and start completely over today?" They stood there waiting for my walls to completely crumble. They expected the news of a grandchild to magically erase the stolen $500,000, the federal tax fraud, and the constant disrespect. I looked at Chloe and her fake tears. I looked at Marcus and his pathetic, desperate smile. I felt a cold wave of absolute disgust wash over my entire body. I did not smile. I did not shed a single tear. "Congratulations," I said, my voice slicing through the air like a sharpened blade. "That is certainly big news. But a baby does not erase a massive federal debt, and it certainly does not rewrite the deed to a luxury penthouse." Chloe dropped her hand from her stomach, her fake smile completely vanishing. "What are you saying, Vivian?" she asked, her voice losing its soft, innocent tone. "I am saying that babies are incredibly expensive," I replied, staring coldly into her eyes. "Formula is expensive. Childcare is expensive. And since you two are about to be completely broke, you better start working double shifts to pay for the diapers. Now get out of my house." Marcus looked entirely shocked by my reaction. "Mom, you cannot be serious," he pleaded. "This is your own grandchild we are talking about. You are going to turn your back on your own blood just because you are mad at us." I pointed my finger firmly toward the heavy oak door. "I am not mad, Marcus," I said calmly. "I am completely indifferent. You made your choices, and now you have to live with the heavy consequences. If you do not walk out of that door right now, I will call the police and have you both escorted off my private property for trespassing." Chloe let out a loud, dramatic scoff of pure anger. Her face turned bright red, and her eyes narrowed into vicious slits. "You are a cold, heartless monster," she spat at me entirely, dropping the sweet daughter-in-law act. "My mother was completely right about you. You do not care about family at all. You only care about your money and your stupid pride." I smiled a cold, empty smile as I reached over and opened the front door wide. "Goodbye, Chloe," I said smoothly. "Have a wonderful pregnancy." Marcus grabbed her arm and pulled her out the door, practically dragging her down the front steps. I slammed the heavy door shut behind them and locked the deadbolt with a loud, satisfying click. I stood in the foyer for a moment, listening to the sound of their car engine starting and the tires screeching aggressively as they sped out of my long driveway. The toxic energy finally left my property, and the deep, peaceful silence returned to my massive home. I walked back into my sunroom feeling completely victorious. I knew their performance was a desperate attempt to stop me from pursuing legal action. I sat back down in my comfortable chair and picked up my cup of chamomile tea. The tea was still warm. I took a slow sip, feeling proud of myself for protecting my boundaries and refusing to be emotionally blackmailed by two absolute frauds. But my peace was suddenly interrupted by the loud buzzing sound of my cell phone resting on the glass table. I leaned forward and picked up the phone, swiping the screen to open the new notification. The message was from Chloe. My brow furrowed in confusion. She had just left my house screaming insults at me. Why would she be sending me a text message right now? I opened the message and began to read the words she had hastily typed. Chloe had been typing a furious message to her mother Susan while sitting in the passenger seat of their car, but in her blind rage, she had accidentally sent the text directly to my phone instead. I stared at the glowing words on the screen. The text message read exactly like this: "The old witch did not buy it. We need to secure the South Lot property before she finds out there is no baby." I sat perfectly still in my sunroom. There was no baby. But what shocked me even more was the mention of the South Lot property. I knew exactly what my next move had to be. I sat perfectly still in my sunroom, staring at the glowing screen of my cell phone. The words Chloe had accidentally sent me burned into my mind. The old witch did not buy it. We need to secure the South Lot property before she finds out there is no baby. I read the message 5 times to ensure I was not misunderstanding her complete betrayal. There was no baby. The tears she cried on my front porch, the gentle way she rubbed her stomach, the emotional speech about making peace for the sake of an innocent child. It was all a carefully constructed performance designed to manipulate my emotions and lower my guard. They honestly believed I was just a lonely old woman, desperate for the title of grandmother. They thought they could use a fake pregnancy to distract me while they plotted to steal even more from my empire. And then there was the mention of the South Lot property. That specific detail made me smile a very cold and dangerous smile. The South Lot was a massive piece of commercial real estate I had purchased decades ago through a completely separate holding company. On paper, it looked like a gold mine perfectly positioned for a luxury development. But in reality, the soil was entirely contaminated from an old chemical plant. The city had condemned the land for any residential or commercial building years ago. It was essentially a highly taxed pile of toxic dirt. If Marcus and Chloe were trying to secure that property, they were walking completely blind into a massive financial trap. I did not reply to the text message. I simply deleted the notification from my screen so Chloe would never know she made such a fatal error. I took a deep breath of the fragrant chamomile tea and began to formulate my exact plan of attack. I knew that if I confronted them immediately, they would just deny everything and find a new way to hide their deceit. I needed them to feel completely safe and victorious. I needed to play the exact role they expected me to play. I needed to become the gullible, forgiving mother who was entirely blinded by the promise of a new grandchild. I waited exactly 24 hours before making my next move. The following afternoon, I picked up my phone and called my son. Marcus answered on the second ring, his voice tight with nervous anticipation. "Mom," he said softly. I took a deep breath and forced my voice to sound tired and completely defeated. "Marcus, I have been doing a lot of praying and a lot of thinking since you and Chloe left my house yesterday," I said, my tone dripping with fake maternal warmth. I was so incredibly angry about the money and the disrespect. But when I sat alone in this big empty house last night, all I could think about was the innocent child growing inside your wife. I realized that my pride is not worth losing my first grandchild. I want to make things right between us. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Marcus was completely silent for a moment, obviously shocked that his terrible plan was actually working. "Mom, do you really mean that?" he asked, his voice suddenly filled with a disgusting amount of false hope. "Yes, I do, Marcus," I replied smoothly. I want you and Chloe to come meet me for lunch tomorrow at the country club. I want to celebrate this beautiful news properly and put all the ugly business behind us for good. We can start over as a real family." He agreed instantly, practically tripping over his own words to thank me. I hung up the phone and walked straight to my closet to pick out a soft pastel outfit that made me look completely harmless. The next day at the country club, Marcus and Chloe arrived looking incredibly smug. Chloe was back in her expensive designer clothes, looking radiant and entirely too confident for a woman carrying a massive lie. When she saw me sitting at the table, she rushed over and wrapped her arms around me in a tight, fake embrace. "Vivian, I am so happy we can finally move forward," she whispered in my ear. I smiled warmly and patted her arm, pulling out a chair for her. We spent the next 2 hours eating expensive salads and talking about baby names and nursery colors. I played my part perfectly. I asked her how she was feeling and told her she was absolutely glowing. I even offered to hire my personal interior designer to help them decorate the nursery in the penthouse. Every time I mentioned spending money, Chloe and Marcus exchanged a quick, greedy look across the table. They thought they had me completely wrapped around their fingers. Toward the end of the lunch, I casually brought up the future of my business empire. I sighed heavily and looked out the window. "You know, Marcus, all this talk about the future has made me realize I need to start stepping back from the business," I said softly. "I want to enjoy being a grandmother. I have been thinking about liquidating some of my older commercial assets, maybe even that old South Lot property down by the river. It is just too much work for me to manage these days." The moment the words left my mouth, I saw Marcus sit up perfectly straight in his chair. His eyes widened, and he quickly looked at Chloe. Chloe placed her hand over her fake pregnant stomach and smiled a very sharp, predatory smile. "That sounds like a wonderful idea, Vivian," she said sweetly. "You should absolutely focus on relaxing and spending time with the baby. Marcus can help you handle all those boring real estate transfers. He is so good at business management." I nodded in agreement, taking a slow sip of my sparkling water. "Yes, he certainly is," I replied, keeping my face entirely blank. I let them leave the lunch feeling completely victorious. But the moment their car pulled out of the parking lot, my soft grandmother persona vanished completely. I drove straight to the downtown financial district, to a very discreet, unmarked office building. My corporate attorney Valerie had arranged a meeting for me with the best private investigator in the state of Georgia. His name was Jackson, and he specialized in forensic accounting and background checks for high-net-worth clients. I sat across from Jackson in his dimly lit office and handed him a thick folder containing every piece of information I had on Chloe and her mother Susan. Jackson was a quiet man who took his work incredibly seriously. "I do not care how much it costs, Jackson," I said, looking him directly in the eye. "This woman Susan claims she comes from generations of old wealth from the Northeast. She acts like she owns the world, but I know a cheap hustler when I see one. I want you to dig into every single aspect of her entire life. I want to know her real maiden name, her credit history, her previous addresses, and every single person she has ever associated with. I want to know exactly how she managed to raise a daughter who thinks it is perfectly acceptable to steal $500,000 from my family." Jackson simply nodded and pulled the folder across his desk. "Consider it done, Vivian," he said quietly. "Give me a few days to run the comprehensive checks. If she is hiding something, I will absolutely find it." I left his office feeling a sense of satisfaction. For the next 5 days, I continued my elaborate performance with Marcus and Chloe. Chloe even had the pure audacity to send me a fake ultrasound picture she had obviously purchased off the internet. I replied with a long, loving message about how beautiful my future grandchild looked. I kept feeding their egos, making them feel entirely secure in their deception. I knew they were spending those days desperately trying to secure a shady loan, using the restaurant assets they had stolen to buy the toxic South Lot property from my hidden company. I just had to be patient and let them dig their own graves. Late on a Thursday night, I was sitting in my living room reading a book when my cell phone suddenly vibrated on the table. The house was completely silent, and the digital clock on the wall read exactly midnight. I picked up the phone and saw Jackson calling. I answered, pressing the phone to my ear. "Jackson, I said quietly. "Are you finding anything useful on our fake socialite friend?" Jackson let out a low whistle on the other end of the line. "Vivian," he said, his voice completely serious. "Your in-law is not who she says she is. You are going to want to see this." I did not sleep at all that Thursday night after Jackson called me. I sat in my quiet living room, watching the hands of the antique grandfather clock slowly tick past midnight and into the early morning hours. The anticipation of finally holding the absolute truth in my hands was far better than any rest I could have possibly gotten. Early the next morning, before the sun even fully crested over the tall trees of my estate, I drove back to the downtown financial district. The city of Atlanta was just beginning to wake up, but my mind had been running at full speed for hours. I navigated the empty streets with a deep sense of purpose, completely focused on the meeting ahead. I walked into the dimly lit office of my private investigator. Jackson was sitting behind his heavy wooden desk with a thick manila folder resting right in the center of the polished surface. He did not smile when I walked in. He simply pointed to the leather guest chair opposite him. I sat down and smoothed the soft fabric of my skirt, taking a deep, calming breath before reaching for the heavy folder. "Open it," Jackson said, his voice rough and completely serious. "You were entirely right about her, Vivian," he stated. "She is not old money. She is not even new money. She is absolutely no money at all." I slowly opened the heavy folder and looked at the very first page of the extensive report. Staring back at me was a stark black and white police mugshot of the woman I knew as Susan. Her hair was completely flat, and her face looked exhausted and incredibly hard. The smug, aristocratic arrogance she constantly paraded around my family was completely missing from this grim photograph. I looked down at the name printed in bold black letters beneath the stark image. Her real name was not Susan at all. Her legal birth name was Sarah Jenkins. I felt a cold, sharp smile begin to form on my lips as I turned the page to read the rest of her pathetic criminal history. Sarah Jenkins was a serial grifter who had spent her entire adult life running from one massive financial disaster to another. Jackson had meticulously pulled records from 4 different states, and every single one told the exact same pathetic story. She deliberately targeted wealthy older men or young gullible fools, convincing them to invest in fake business ventures or luxury real estate developments that never actually existed. She did not have a trust fund hidden away in a prestigious bank. She did not have a wealthy family from the Northeast with generations of accumulated status. She had a long, endless string of evicted apartments, repossessed luxury cars, and entirely maxed-out credit cards under 3 different stolen identities. The thick folder detailed a massive trail of absolute financial destruction spanning over 2 decades. The most recent legal documents included in the file were from the state of Texas. There were multiple active federal warrants for her immediate arrest regarding felony wire fraud and grand larceny. According to the detailed police reports, she had successfully convinced a group of elderly investors in Dallas to hand over their entire life savings to fund a fake luxury retirement community. When the investment money vanished, Sarah Jenkins vanished right along with it, leaving ruined lives in her wake. She fled Texas in the middle of the night and somehow ended up in Atlanta, completely changing her name to Susan and adopting a fake transatlantic accent to hide her poor Southern roots. I read through the personal bank statements Jackson had illegally obtained through his deep network of secure contacts. Her active accounts were completely overdrawn by thousands of dollars. She owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to various predatory lending companies and angry private investors who were actively hunting her down. The expensive designer clothes she wore to my restaurant, the luxury handbags she carried around like trophies, the expensive, extravagant dinners she constantly bragged about were all purchased on stolen credit or forged checks entirely. She was currently drowning in a massive dark ocean of insurmountable debt, and she was desperately searching for a permanent lifeline to save her from going straight to federal prison. That was exactly why she targeted my son Marcus in the first place. I looked up at Jackson, completely fascinated by the sheer reckless audacity of this desperate, pathetic woman. "She thought your son Marcus was a billionaire heir," Jackson explained, leaning back in his creaking leather chair and crossing his arms over his chest. When her daughter Chloe first started dating your son, Susan did a very shallow, uneducated background check on your restaurant empire. She saw the massive reported revenue numbers, the prime commercial real estate locations scattered across the city, and the luxury foreign cars your son drove to their dates. She completely misunderstood the financial dynamic of your entire family. She falsely assumed Marcus had full, unrestricted access to all of your corporate money. She thought he was a spoiled rich kid with an unlimited multi-million-dollar trust fund waiting for him. She aggressively pushed Chloe to marry him as fast as possible so they could finally secure a permanent source of generational wealth. She desperately wanted to use your naive son as a personal piggy bank to pay off her massive outstanding debts in Texas before the federal authorities finally caught up with her and locked her away forever. The absolute hilarious irony of the entire situation hit me like a heavy physical blow. Susan thought she was brilliantly scamming a wealthy heir, but Marcus was entirely dependent on my personal generosity to survive. They were two completely broke, desperate frauds frantically trying to scam each other while pretending to be fabulously wealthy socialites. Susan gave Marcus a completely fake image of high society elegance, and Marcus gave Susan a completely fake image of endless corporate funds. Neither of them had a single legitimate dime to their actual names. The $500,000 Marcus illegally stole from his dead father was probably the only real cash either of them had seen in 10 years. And now that money was completely gone, flushed down the drain of their mutual shallow delusions to maintain a pathetic lie. I slowly closed the manila folder and rested my hands flat on top of the smooth cardboard surface. A deep, powerful sense of complete peace washed over my entire body, relaxing my tense muscles. I finally had them exactly where I wanted them. I had the exact weapon I needed to destroy their entire fake empire and protect my hard-earned legacy forever without ever raising my voice. Vivian, what exactly do you want me to do with this explosive information? Jackson asked quietly, watching my calm face carefully. Do you want me to call the local Atlanta police right now and have her arrested immediately? I slowly shook my head side to side, keeping my cold smile perfectly in place. No, Jackson, I said smoothly, my voice dripping with calculated, endless patience. If we call the local police right now, they will just arrest her in some random apartment building quietly. That is far too easy, and it does not teach my arrogant son the brutal, unforgettable lesson he desperately needs to learn about loyalty and respect. I want you to package all of this undeniable evidence perfectly into a secure digital file. I want you to include the active felony warrants from Texas, the fake stolen identities, and the massive bank fraud records. I want you to forward the entire comprehensive file directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation headquarters. But Jackson, I need you to strictly delay the final delivery of this package. Do not send it to them today. I need you to schedule the send exactly 5 days from now. I want the federal agents to receive it right before her massive upcoming anniversary gala event. Jackson raised a single eyebrow, fully understanding the absolute public devastation I was currently planning for them. You want the federal agents to arrest her in public? He asked, a slight knowing smile finally playing on his lips. I want them to arrest her in front of every single fake, pretentious friend she has desperately collected in this entire city. I replied slowly, standing up from my chair and picking up my purse. I want her completely humiliated and destroyed in the exact same way she tried to humiliate me at my own dining table. I left Jackson sitting in his dark office and drove back to my peaceful estate, feeling exactly like a brilliant general who had just won a massive bloody war without ever lifting a single physical weapon. The beautiful trap was perfectly set, and all I had to do now was wait patiently for the blind rats to take the poisoned bait. When I walked into my quiet, empty house, I poured myself a glass of cold water, opened my laptop computer, and logged into my personal social media accounts. I rarely ever checked these silly websites, but I wanted to see exactly what my foolish son was doing today. I navigated directly to his professional business networking page. Sitting right there at the very top of his public profile was a brand new arrogant post published just a few short hours ago. Marcus had proudly posted a picture of himself standing confidently in front of a massive, overgrown field of brown dirt and dead weeds. He was wearing his expensive tailored suit, smiling brightly at the camera with his arms crossed over his chest in a pose of absolute arrogant victory. The long caption typed beneath the photo made me laugh out loud in the empty, echoing room. It read that massive big things were finally coming to the great city of Atlanta. He boldly bragged about officially closing a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate deal for the historic South Lot property. He publicly thanked his beautiful, supportive wife Chloe and his amazing, brilliant mother-in-law Susan for their endless love and incredible business advice during this transaction. He actually wrote that he was immensely proud to finally step out of the dark shadows and build his own massive legacy completely independent of his past family ties. He honestly thought he was an absolute genius. He truly believed he had completely outsmarted his own mother and fully secured his financial freedom forever with this brilliant land purchase. He had absolutely no idea the devastating truth about the land he was currently standing on in that photograph. He did not know that the South Lot was completely condemned by the city due to severe toxic chemical contamination in the soil, making it completely illegal to build anything on it. And the most beautiful part of this entire magnificent disaster was that he had absolutely no idea who actually sold him that worthless piece of poisoned dirt. He had just illegally borrowed $2 million from highly dangerous criminal loan sharks to purchase a useless toxic waste dump from a hidden anonymous shell company. A shell company that was entirely owned and operated by me. I closed my laptop screen and took a slow, refreshing sip of my cold water, completely ready for the grand finale. I knew the next few days were going to be the most satisfying days of my entire life, because my peace was finally secured forever. Sunday morning arrived with a bright and deceptive sunshine over the city of Atlanta. I woke up early and prepared myself for the traditional Sunday service at my local church. This was the same church my family had attended for 3 entire decades. I carefully selected a tailored emerald green suit that perfectly complemented my skin tone and matched it with a wide-brimmed hat. I knew exactly what was waiting for me inside those heavy wooden doors. I knew my older sister Denise would use the holy sanctuary as a stage for her personal theater and wicked lies today. Denise always used religion as a convenient weapon whenever she felt threatened or whenever she wanted to destroy someone else. I parked my luxury sedan in my designated parking spot near the front entrance and walked up the stone steps with my head held high. The usher opened the heavy doors, and the familiar sound of the gospel choir filled the air. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my heels clicking softly against the polished hardwood floor. I could feel the immediate shift in the atmosphere the moment I entered the large room with quiet, unbothered, calm confidence now. The warm smiles I usually received from the congregation were completely missing today. Instead, I was met with cold stares and awkward, averted eyes from the people I had known for years. I ignored the sudden chill in the room and walked directly to my usual seat in the very front pew. I sat down, smoothed my emerald green skirt, and looked straight ahead at the large wooden cross. I did not have to turn my head to know exactly where the toxic rumors were coming from because the negative energy was radiating strongly from behind my straight back today. My sister Denise was sitting 3 rows behind me right in the center of the church gossiping circle. I could hear her loud, aggressive whispers cutting through the beautiful music of the choir. She was leaning over the wooden pews talking to the church elders and the wealthy widows. Denise was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She told them I was a heartless monster who had completely abandoned my only son. She told them I had cruelly kicked my pregnant daughter-in-law out of my home, leaving them to suffer on the cold, dangerous city streets alone. She dramatically placed her hand over her heart and asked the congregation to pray for my dark and wicked soul. She painted a vivid picture of Chloe crying on my front porch, begging for mercy for the sake of an unborn child. The older women gasped and shook their heads in pure disgust, looking at the back of my head with intense judgment. They whispered about how money had completely corrupted my spirit and turned me against my own flesh and blood. They muttered that I did not deserve the blessings God had given me in this wonderful life today. I sat perfectly still in the front pew, listening to every single vicious lie my sister spread through the holy sanctuary. I did not turn around to defend myself. I did not let a single emotion show on my face. I knew the absolute truth. I knew there was no baby, and I knew Marcus had stolen $500,000 from his dead father. But I refused to lower myself to her pathetic level and argue in the middle of a church service. I simply opened my hymn book and sang the morning songs with a steady voice today. I let Denise have her moment of glorious attention. I let her feel powerful and righteous. When the service finally ended, the pastor delivered his closing prayer, and the congregation began to file out of the building. As I walked down the aisle toward the exit, people actively stepped out of my way, as if I had a contagious disease. Denise was waiting for me near the front doors, surrounded by her eager audience of gossiping friends. She wore a smug, triumphant smile on her face, completely thrilled by the social damage she had inflicted upon my personal reputation today. She thought she had successfully turned my entire spiritual community against me. "Good morning, Vivian," Denise said loudly, making sure everyone in the lobby could hear her fake sweet voice. "We were just praying for you and your hardened heart. We pray that you find the grace to accept your new grandchild and forgive Marcus for whatever tiny mistakes he might have made." I stopped walking and looked directly into her eyes. I did not scream or cause a scene. I simply offered her a very calm and peaceful smile while looking deep into her extremely dark, jealous soul now. "Thank you for your prayers, Denise," I replied smoothly. "I am sure God hears exactly what is in your heart today." I turned around and walked out of the church, leaving her standing there looking slightly confused by my lack of anger. I drove back to my quiet estate feeling incredibly calm. Denise thought she had won a massive victory today, but she had completely forgotten one very important financial detail about her beloved church. For the past 10 years, I had been the largest single financial donor to our church congregation, providing endless financial support to everyone involved constantly. Every single year, I donated $50,000 to fund the community outreach programs, the youth choir, and the building maintenance. But because I never wanted to be praised for my charity, I had set up the annual donation through my corporate holding company and allowed Denise to present the giant check to the pastor in her own name. It was my gift to her so she could feel important and respected in the community she loved so much. The church elders completely believed that Denise was a wealthy philanthropist because of my silent generosity and total financial power always. I had allowed her to wear a crown that I paid for. But after her vicious behavior this morning, I decided it was finally time to take my expensive crown back. I woke up early on Monday morning and made myself a fresh cup of coffee. At exactly 9 o'clock, I picked up my phone and called my personal banker, Thomas. "Good morning, Thomas," I said, taking a sip of my warm coffee. "I need you to cancel the automatic $50,000 annual transfer to the First Baptist Church immediately without any further questions or unnecessary processing delays today." Thomas did not ask any questions. He simply typed on his keyboard and confirmed that the massive transfer was officially canceled. Then I made my second phone call of the morning. I called the senior pastor of the church directly on his private office line. "Good morning, Pastor," I said, my voice entirely pleasant and completely professional. "I am calling regarding the annual $50,000 donation that is usually presented by my sister Denise this week." The pastor sounded incredibly happy to hear from me immediately, thanking me for the continued blessings my family provided to the church forever. "I am calling to inform you that the funds will not be arriving this year or any year in the future," I explained calmly. "You see, Pastor, that money has always come directly from my personal corporate accounts, not from my sister. I simply allowed Denise to put her name on the paperwork as a kind gesture. But due to some recent changes in my financial planning, I am legally revoking all funding associated with her name. If Denise wishes to continue her generous charitable giving, she will have to use her own personal bank accounts from now on, forever." There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the phone. The pastor was completely shocked to learn that his biggest donor was actually me and not my loud, boastful sister. "I understand, Vivian," the pastor finally said, his voice sounding incredibly disappointed and nervous. "I will have to call Denise immediately to discuss how we will cover the massive budget deficit for the upcoming community events." I smiled into the phone. "I think that is a wonderful idea, Pastor," I replied. "Have a truly blessed day." I hung up the phone feeling completely victorious inside my soul. While Denise was busy dealing with the complete collapse of her fake holy reputation, my foolish son and his deceptive wife were busy walking straight into the massive trap I had set for them. Marcus and Chloe took the absolute bait for the South Lot property. They used the restaurant limited liability company as direct collateral to secure a shady $2 million loan from a highly dangerous predatory lending firm. They thought they were buying a gold mine, but they just chained themselves to a massive illegal debt for a piece of poisoned land they could never, ever safely use. The dark, heavy oak doors of the downtown lending firm closed quietly behind my son Marcus. I was not there in the room, but I knew exactly what was happening inside those walls. Marcus was sitting across from men who did not wear tailored suits or smile for the cameras. These were dangerous men who operated in the dark corners of the financial world. They offered quick cash with interest rates that could drown a man in a matter of weeks. Marcus picked up a heavy gold pen and signed his name on the dotted line. He pledged the entire operating structure of my restaurant chain as collateral for a massive $2 million loan. He thought he was stepping into the big leagues of commercial real estate. He honestly believed he was brilliant. He did not read the tiny print at the bottom of the pages. He just saw the enormous check waiting for him and signed his life away completely. Susan was waiting for him in the lobby of the building, pacing back and forth on the marble floor. When Marcus walked out holding the approved loan documents, she practically screamed with joy. She threw her arms around his neck and kissed his cheek, acting like he was the greatest businessman in the history of Atlanta. Susan was absolutely ecstatic because she thought her fake wealthy lifestyle was finally permanently secured. She had spent the entire morning looking at expensive brochures for luxury cars and high-end designer clothes. She was already spending the money in her mind before the ink on the contract was even dry. She told Marcus that they were going to build a massive luxury shopping plaza that would rival the most exclusive properties in the country. She fed his massive ego, telling him he was a visionary leader who had finally stepped out of his mother and her dark shadow. Chloe was playing her part perfectly as well, acting the role of the supportive pregnant wife. She posted a long emotional message on her social media pages, talking about generational wealth and building an empire for her unborn child. She rubbed her completely flat stomach and smiled for the camera, pretending to be the picture of pure maternal grace. They all went out to a ridiculously expensive steakhouse to celebrate their massive financial victory. Marcus ordered the most expensive bottles of champagne and toasted to his own supposed genius. They laughed and joked about how I was just a bitter old woman who did not understand modern business strategies. They thought they had successfully stolen my life work and used it to elevate themselves to the highest ranks of society. They were celebrating their absolute victory while standing directly on top of a massive trapdoor that I had personally built for them. While they were busy drinking expensive champagne and celebrating their imaginary wealth, I was sitting in a very different kind of office. I drove across town to the beautiful glass building where my corporate attorney Valerie managed her elite law firm. Valerie was a sharp, highly intelligent black woman who had helped me navigate the ruthless business world for over 20 years. She did not play games and she never lost a legal battle. I walked into her spacious corner office and sat down in the comfortable leather chair facing her large wooden desk. Valerie poured me a cup of hot black coffee and handed me a thick stack of legal documents. These were not predatory loans or fake property deeds. These were ironclad trust funds and asset protection contracts. We were legally separating every single piece of my true wealth from the restaurant operating company that Marcus thought he had stolen. Valerie explained every single page of the documents in her calm, steady voice. We moved the deeds to my massive commercial properties into a brand new blind trust that no one in my family even knew existed. We secured the cash accounts, the investment portfolios, and the retirement funds behind layers of impenetrable legal protection. By the time I signed the final page of the contract, the restaurant company Marcus had stolen was nothing more than an empty shell. It held absolutely no real assets. It only held the massive federal tax debt that my sister Denise had secretly created years ago. I was completely severing myself from the sinking ship that Marcus was now proudly steering. Valerie looked at me over the rim of her coffee cup and smiled a small, knowing smile. She knew exactly what I was doing, and she fully supported my ruthless strategy to protect my hard-earned legacy. "You know, Valerie," I said quietly, looking out the large window at the beautiful Atlanta skyline. "I spent my entire life trying to build a safe, comfortable world for my son. I worked long, exhausting hours so he would never have to struggle or worry about money. I thought I was protecting him, but I was actually just making him incredibly weak. He became soft and entitled, believing that everything should just be handed to him on a silver platter. When he met Chloe and Susan, he was the perfect easy target for their pathetic scams. They used his deep insecurities and his desperate need for validation to turn him against his own mother. But I am not going to let them destroy everything my husband and I built with our bare hands. I am going to teach them a lesson they will never forget for the rest of their miserable, pathetic lives today." Valerie nodded in complete agreement, sorting the signed papers into neat, organized piles on her desk. She told me that the trap was now perfectly legally secured and absolutely impossible to escape. Marcus had signed the predatory loan using the empty restaurant company as his only collateral. The dangerous men who gave him the $2 million would soon realize that the company was entirely worthless and buried in massive federal tax debt. They would not take him to court to get their money back. They would use much more aggressive and terrifying methods to collect their debt. Marcus had willingly tied himself to highly dangerous criminals just to impress a fake socialite and her lying daughter. He had completely destroyed his own future because he was too arrogant and stupid to realize he was being played by everyone around him. But the greatest part of the entire scheme was the property itself. The historic South Lot that Marcus was so incredibly proud of purchasing was not a gold mine. It was not a prime location for a luxury shopping plaza or a high-end residential development. The South Lot was a massive piece of empty land located near the old industrial district by the river. Decades ago, a massive chemical manufacturing plant had operated on that exact spot. The plant had illegally dumped thousands of gallons of toxic hazardous waste directly into the soil for many years before it was finally shut down by the federal government. The land was deeply, permanently poisoned. The city of Atlanta had officially condemned the entire property, making it strictly illegal to build any structures or dig any foundations on the site. It was a massive toxic wasteland completely useless to any legitimate real estate developer or business investor in the entire state of Georgia right now. Marcus had absolutely no idea about the toxic history of the land because he was too lazy and arrogant to do any basic legal research. He relied entirely on the fake advice of his mother-in-law, Susan, who knew absolutely nothing about commercial real estate. They just saw a massive piece of land in the city and assumed they could easily flip it for a massive profit. They eagerly handed over the borrowed $2 million to secure the deed, thinking they had just won the ultimate real estate lottery. They thought they were brilliant, visionary investors who were about to change the skyline of Atlanta forever. But they were actually just proud owners of a poisoned dirt pit that carried massive annual property taxes and strict government environmental regulations. They had chained themselves to a massive financial nightmare that would absolutely destroy their fake wealthy lifestyle forever. But the absolute best part of this entire magnificent disaster was the hidden identity of the person who actually sold them the land. When Marcus wired the $2 million to finalize the purchase, he sent the money to an anonymous corporate holding company. He never bothered to look past the fake corporate name on the legal documents. He never realized that the shell company was carefully created and fully controlled by his own mother. I was the anonymous seller who had just happily pocketed the $2 million of dirty loan shark money. I had successfully sold my worthless, toxic wasteland to my own arrogant son at a massive, unbelievable profit today. The trap was fully closed. The massive envelope arrived at my front door on a Tuesday afternoon, perfectly sealed with heavy gold wax and stamped with an elaborate fake family crest. I stood in my very quiet foyer and slowly broke the wax seal, pulling out a thick piece of expensive cardstock that smelled strongly of cheap artificial perfume. It was an official invitation to a combined anniversary gala and baby shower hosted by Susan Jenkins. She was renting the grand ballroom at one of the most exclusive five-star hotels in downtown Atlanta to celebrate the fake milestones of her entirely fake life completely. The invitation was incredibly arrogant and entirely excessive, just like the pathetic woman who sent it to me. It listed a strict formal dress code and boasted about a multi-course catered dinner with a live expensive string quartet. She had invited over 200 guests, including local politicians, wealthy business owners, and every single pretentious socialite she could possibly find in the city. I knew exactly why she wanted such a massive audience tonight. Susan was flying incredibly high on the fake success of the toxic real estate deal my foolish son Marcus had just closed using dangerous money. She honestly, truly believed they were all officially multimillionaires, now and forever. She thought she had completely conquered Atlanta and established her absolute dominance over my family without facing any consequences. I turned the thick cardstock over and found a handwritten note on the back, scribbled in Susan and her incredibly messy handwriting. The demanding note specifically insisted that I bring the official legal deed to the Midtown luxury penthouse as my formal baby gift to Chloe tonight. She wrote that it was finally time for me to step aside and hand over my property to the younger generation publicly. She was planning to use the massive crowd of wealthy strangers to aggressively pressure me into signing away my multi-million-dollar property forever. She wanted to corner me publicly, thinking I would be too deeply embarrassed to refuse her demands in front of the local elite crowd. She wanted to deliberately humiliate me and portray me as a bitter, stingy old woman if I ever dared to say no. I read the pathetic, threatening note twice, and then I smiled a very slow and peaceful smile. I did not throw the invitation in the trash or call my son complaining. I simply walked into my home office and placed the gold envelope perfectly on the exact center of my heavy wooden desk. I picked up my cell phone and called the hotel catering manager to formally reserve my spot for the grand event. I told them I would be attending with a +1, and I formally requested a reserved seat very close to the main presentation stage. If Susan genuinely wanted a spectacular public show, I was absolutely going to give her a dramatic performance that this entire city would never ever forget for the rest of their lives. I spent the next few days existing in a state of absolute perfect calm and quiet, unbroken peace. I did not feel a single ounce of dark anxiety or crippling fear about the upcoming massive confrontation. When you know exactly how the entire brutal war is going to ultimately end, you do not ever panic before the final bloody battle begins. You simply prepare your sharpest weapons and wait patiently for the perfect, opportune moment to strike hard. I decided to deliberately dedicate the entire day before the gala exclusively to my own personal care and intense mental preparation completely. I drove my car directly to my favorite luxury spa located far away in the affluent northern suburbs of the beautiful city. I happily spent 4 incredibly relaxing hours enjoying a deep tissue massage, a sea salt body scrub, and a very calming facial treatment. I wanted my dark skin to absolutely glow beautifully with the radiant positive energy of a strong woman who had completely secured her personal boundaries and powerfully protected her massive financial legacy. After the wonderful spa treatment, I visited my personal hairstylist who had perfectly managed my natural hair for over 15 long years. I told her I desperately needed a unique style that instantly commanded absolute, unquestionable respect from everyone in the entire massive room. She gently washed and carefully conditioned my hair, slowly pressing it until it was completely sleek and perfectly straight, falling elegantly around my strong shoulders. I looked closely into the large, bright salon mirror and saw a gorgeous, confident woman who was entirely unbothered by the foolish, childish games of amateur desperate grifters. The absolute most important decision of the entire stressful week was choosing the exact outfit I would purposefully wear to completely destroy Susan tonight entirely. I did not want to ever wear a traditional boring black dress because black is the classic color of sad mourning, and I was definitely not attending a depressing funeral today. I was joyfully attending a highly anticipated public execution. I boldly walked right into the private fitting room of my absolute favorite high-end clothing boutique located downtown. The personal shopper had already carefully pulled several expensive conservative dresses for me, but I completely ignored all of them instantly. I confidently walked straight to the back of the large store and quickly found exactly what I truly needed today. It was an absolutely stunning, perfectly tailored, two-piece, gorgeous power suit, dyed in a deep, vibrant shade of dark blood red. The bold color was incredibly loud and totally unapologetically fierce. It was the exact symbolic color of immense power, absolute victory, and total, ruthless, unbroken authority. I excitedly put the beautiful suit on and confidently stepped out of the small dressing room to look closely at the massive floor-to-ceiling glass mirror. The incredibly sharp, sleek lines of the blazer perfectly accentuated my strong, broad shoulders, and the elegantly tailored pants flawlessly elongated my beautiful legs perfectly. I perfectly paired the brilliant dark red suit with a pair of sleek black expensive designer heels and a very simple but incredibly heavy solid gold necklace wrapped tightly around my neck. I truly looked like a massive, beautiful, uncontainable burning fire, fully ready to completely consume absolutely everything standing directly in its highly destructive path. I quickly bought the gorgeous suit immediately and happily drove my car back to my quiet estate, feeling incredibly powerful and absolutely totally ready for the explosive night ahead. On the quiet evening of the grand gala, I sat entirely alone, waiting patiently. I sat peacefully in my completely quiet, empty living room, waiting patiently for my incredibly important final guest to finally arrive. The bright, warm sun was just beginning to slowly set, casting very long, dark, spooky shadows entirely across my perfectly manicured green lawn outside. Right on exact time, the heavy solid iron gates of my long, dark driveway smoothly opened, and a sleek black, expensive town car slowly pulled up directly to my grand front door. My brilliant corporate attorney, Valerie, confidently stepped right out of the dark car, wearing an incredibly sharp, beautiful navy blue tailored suit, confidently. She was carefully carrying a small, dark black, shiny leather briefcase tightly in her right hand. She truly looked incredibly deeply focused and entirely completely ready for total, absolute war tonight. She gracefully walked directly into my large grand foyer and silently handed me a beautiful crystal glass filled entirely with expensive, cold, sparkling water. We confidently stood together in the completely quiet, peaceful entryway of my massive, beautiful home, carefully going over the absolute final, intricate details of the massive, deadly trap we had successfully built together over the deeply stressful, incredibly busy past few long weeks recently. Valerie confidently opened her dark leather briefcase and proudly pulled out a tiny, small, shiny silver flash drive, slowly holding it directly up to the bright, warm light so I could vividly see it very clearly today. This incredibly tiny, shiny piece of cold, solid metal successfully contains every single piece of absolute total destruction you originally formally requested, Valerie loudly said, her deep voice sounding perfectly, completely calm and entirely, totally devoid of any soft human mercy. It safely holds the high-resolution, clear photographs of the highly active federal criminal arrest warrants for Sarah Jenkins directly from Texas. It firmly holds the official Internal Revenue Service documents proving Marcus owes $3 million in massive tax debt completely. It also holds the undeniable, unredacted property records proving the historic South Lot is a highly toxic condemned chemical wasteland. I confidently reached out and smoothly took the cold, shiny silver flash drive directly from her very steady hand. I truly felt the incredibly heavy, massive weight of the absolute entire truth resting perfectly in my right palm. The tiny metal object was a massive loaded bomb. Everything is locked and loaded. Vivian, the feds, and the bank are waiting. The black town car pulled up to the grand entrance of the expensive hotel in Atlanta. The valet rushed to open my door, but I took a moment to look out the window at the building before stepping out. The hotel was famous for hosting exclusive high society events, but tonight it was simply a stage for a complete fraud. I stepped out of the car, and the warm evening air hit my face. I smoothed the jacket of my blood-red power suit, making sure every crease was perfect. Valerie stepped out from the other side, holding her black leather briefcase tightly in her right hand. We did not speak as we walked up the marble steps and pushed through the heavy glass doors. The lobby was filled with the scent of orchids and perfume, but all I could smell was sheer desperation. We walked toward the ballroom, following the sounds of a live string quartet. 2 large doors stood open, guarded by security checking names on a list. I simply walked past them with absolute authority. Valerie walked beside me, her navy suit contrasting perfectly with my red outfit. We stepped into the grand ballroom, and I immediately took in the ridiculous magnitude of the lie my foolish son was funding. The room was transformed into a spectacle of unearned wealth. There were massive floral arrangements of white roses sitting on every table, and large crystal chandeliers casting a golden glow over the crowd. In the center of the room stood a massive ice sculpture shaped like a swan melting onto a silver tray. It was completely absurd and a massive waste of money. The room was packed with over 200 people, and almost all of them were wealthy white socialites wearing expensive gowns and tuxedos. These were the exact people Susan had tricked into believing she was a wealthy heiress from the Northeast. I scanned the crowded room and quickly spotted my son Marcus holding court near the open bar. He was wearing an expensive custom tuxedo, holding a glass of dark liquor, and laughing loudly at a joke. He was aggressively gesturing with his hands, acting like a brilliant Silicon Valley chief executive officer who had just conquered the commercial real estate market. Standing right next to him was his lying wife, Chloe. She was wearing a silver maternity gown that purposefully accentuated her fake pregnant stomach. She was placing her hand delicately on her lower back and smiling radiantly at a large group of older women who were eagerly congratulating her on the fake baby. It made me feel physically sick to watch them accept expensive gifts and endless praise for a child that absolutely did not exist at all. I slowly began to walk through the crowded room, the thick carpet silencing my black heels. I noticed my older sister Denise, standing near the dessert table piled high with expensive pastries. Denise was wearing an overly sequined blue dress, trying desperately to blend in with the high society crowd. She was holding a small plate of appetizers and nodding eagerly at whatever the people around her were saying. When Denise spotted me walking through the crowd, her fake smile instantly vanished. She turned her back to me, pretending she had not seen me. I ignored her pathetic existence and continued my deliberate path toward the front of the room. People finally began to notice me as I moved through the sea of neutral-colored gowns and dark suits. My vibrant blood-red suit stood out like a flashing warning sign in a sea of boring colors. I could hear the hushed whispers rippling through the wealthy crowd as they leaned into each other, asking who I was and why I was dressed so fiercely. They did not know I was the actual wealthy woman who silently funded this entire pathetic circus. Suddenly, the loud classical music from the string quartet faded away entirely, replaced by the sharp screeching sound of microphone feedback echoing through the speakers. The loud chatter in the room quickly died down completely as everyone turned their attention toward the large elevated stage set up at the far end of the beautiful ballroom. Susan was walking up the wooden steps, holding a wireless microphone tightly in her right hand. She was wearing a ridiculous, oversized gold ball gown that made her look like a melting piece of cheap-wrapped candy. She tapped the top of the microphone twice, ensuring everyone was paying strict attention to her. "Welcome, everyone," Susan said, her voice projecting loudly through the expensive sound system. Her fake transatlantic accent was thicker and more obnoxious than ever before. "Thank you all so much for coming out tonight to celebrate this incredible dual milestone with our growing family. Tonight, we are not just celebrating the wonderful anniversary of my beautiful daughter Chloe and my incredibly brilliant son-in-law Marcus. We are also celebrating the incredibly joyous arrival of my very first beautiful grandchild and the highly successful real estate empire this young power couple is currently building together in our wonderful city." The crowd erupted into polite, supportive applause. Marcus proudly raised his glass from the back of the room, eating up the fake praise like a starving dog. Susan smiled widely and waited patiently for the loud applause to die down completely before she continued. She slowly scanned the crowd with her eyes searching the faces until she finally locked her gaze directly onto me, standing perfectly still near the front reserved tables. A highly toxic, smug smile spread slowly across her face as she tightened her grip on the microphone. She was ready to deliver her massive insult. But tonight is also a very special night for another very specific reason. Susan continued, her voice dripping with pure venom, carefully disguised as sweet hospitality. We believe it is incredibly important to always remember exactly where you come from and to generously give back to those who have significantly less than we do in this world. Susan took a dramatic step forward, pointing directly at me so the entire room of 200 people would turn and look at my face. I would like to take a very special moment to personally welcome a very special guest tonight. Please everyone give a very warm round of applause for Marcus and his mother Vivian. Vivian is a hard-working, less fortunate guest from the inner city who spent her entire life working running a small local food business. She has never experienced a beautiful, luxurious night quite like this before in her entire life. So we really wanted to generously invite her here to finally experience a small taste of true elegance and real high society. Let us all make her feel very welcome tonight, despite her extremely rough edges and complete lack of formal social training. The entire grand ballroom went completely dead silent. The massive insult hung in the warm air like a thick, toxic cloud of poison. 200 wealthy faces turned to stare at me with sheer pity and undisguised condescension. Denise looked down at her shoes, entirely embarrassed to be related to me at all. Marcus looked completely terrified, quickly putting his drink down on the bar as he realized his mother-in-law had just made a highly fatal, uncalculated error by directly attacking me. Chloe stood frozen, her hand still resting tightly on her fake stomach, unsure of what to do next. Susan stood proudly on the stage, looking incredibly pleased with herself, truly believing she had just successfully humiliated me in front of the most powerful people in the entire city. She wanted me to lose my temper and ruin the event so she could play the absolute victim. I did not flinch. I did not frown. I did not show a single ounce of human emotion on my face. I simply looked to my left at Valerie, who was standing right next to me, holding the dark black leather briefcase securely in her hands. Valerie gave me a single confident nod. I slowly turned my attention directly back to the stage and began to walk forward. The grand ballroom was incredibly quiet. The wealthy crowd parted completely terrified by the sheer immense aura of dark burning power radiating forcefully from my bright red suit. I walked slowly up the 3 wooden steps to the elevated stage, keeping my eyes completely locked onto the terrified face of the woman who just insulted me. Susan suddenly realized something was truly, terribly wrong. Her smug, triumphant smile violently collapsed, and her eyes grew incredibly wide with sudden rushing, sheer panic as I stepped directly into her deeply personal space. I walked right up to her, maintaining absolute, highly intense, dead eye contact. I did not ask for permission. I did not say a single word to her. I reached out my right hand and smoothly took the wireless microphone right out of her trembling fingers. I stood on the elevated wooden stage, holding the wireless microphone tightly in my right hand. The smooth metal felt incredibly cold against my warm skin. Susan stood frozen right next to me, completely paralyzed by the massive sudden shift in power. Her empty eyes were wide with sheer terror, and her jaw hung open in absolute shock. She tried to reach out and take the microphone back, but I simply took one confident step forward, blocking her entirely. I looked out over the massive sea of 200 wealthy guests. The grand ballroom was completely dead silent right now. The incredibly loud string quartet had stopped playing their expensive instruments entirely. The waiters carrying heavy silver trays of champagne stood perfectly still near the large crystal doors. Every single eye in the massive room was completely locked onto my bright blood-red power suit. They were entirely captivated by the intense, heavy energy radiating from my calm posture. I did not rush to speak, because absolute power never, ever rushes. I took a deep, slow breath and looked directly at my son Marcus, standing near the open bar. His face was completely drained of all human color, completely now. Marcus looked exactly like a guilty little boy who knew a massive, painful punishment was finally coming soon. Chloe stood right next to him, aggressively clutching her fake pregnant stomach with trembling hands. I raised the heavy microphone to my lips and began to speak clearly. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice echoing smoothly and powerfully through the expensive hotel sound system. "My name is Vivian, and I am the proud mother of Marcus today. I want to personally thank Susan for that incredibly colorful and highly imaginative introduction she just graciously provided for me right here tonight entirely." I slowly turned my head and looked directly at Susan, who was now sweating profusely under the bright stage lights. She called me a less fortunate, hard-working guest from the inner city. I continued my tone completely flat and entirely devoid of any warm emotion. "She told you all that I have never experienced true elegance or real high society before tonight entirely. I suppose she genuinely believes that wearing a cheap rented ball gown and speaking with a completely fake accent is the true definition of elite elegance today." The wealthy crowd shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, quietly listening now. I slowly paced across the wide wooden stage, my black designer heels clicking sharply against the polished floorboards. "Let me properly introduce myself to this massive room," I said loudly. "I am not a poor charity case who needs a free catered meal. I am the sole owner and chief executive officer of Southside Holdings entirely. I own multiple highly profitable commercial real estate properties across the entire state of Georgia. I built a massive multi-million-dollar restaurant empire completely from scratch, using my own two bare hands and the brilliant business mind of my late beloved husband, forever today." A loud collective gasp slowly rippled through the crowded ballroom as the wealthy guests finally realized exactly who I truly was. They instantly recognized my corporate holding company name because I owned the very buildings where many of their expensive private businesses were currently located. I saw several older men in expensive tailored suits physically lean forward in their velvet chairs, looking at me with sudden, deep, absolute respect. Susan took a tiny, terrified step backward, her entire fake aristocratic persona completely crumbling into pathetic dust. She had absolutely no idea about the massive scale of my huge wealth today. I stopped pacing and looked directly at the crowd again. "We are all gathered here tonight to allegedly celebrate a beautiful anniversary and the joyous arrival of a new, innocent baby," I said smoothly. Susan just stood up here and bragged endlessly about the massive commercial real estate empire my son and her daughter are currently building together. She proudly boasted about the incredible generational wealth they have successfully secured for their growing family. It is an incredibly beautiful fairy tale story filled with bright hope and massive luxury. But unfortunately, every single word is a massive, terrible lie entirely. The heavy silence in the grand ballroom shattered instantly. Loud, frantic whispers exploded across the massive room as the wealthy guests turned to look at each other in absolute shock. I saw my older sister Denise drop her small appetizer plate directly onto the expensive hotel carpet. The ceramic plate shattered into tiny, sharp pieces, but nobody even looked down at the messy floor. Marcus frantically put his glass of expensive dark liquor down on the bar and took a highly panicked step toward the main stage. "Mom, please safely stop," he loudly pleaded, his voice cracking with pure fear. I completely ignored his pathetic, desperate plea. I did not come here tonight to be quietly insulted by a desperate, pathetic grifter, and I certainly did not come here to celebrate a massive, toxic illusion, I announced loudly, my voice cutting directly through the chaotic noise of the large crowd. "I came here tonight to give my only son and his incredibly lovely wife the absolute greatest gift of all today." I looked directly into the terrified eyes of Chloe, who was now aggressively pulling on the sleeve of her husband. "I am here to give them the absolute truth." I slowly lowered the wireless microphone down to my side and looked toward the back corner of the grand ballroom quietly. I made direct eye contact with the young audio-visual technician, standing nervously near the massive soundboard. Earlier this evening, my brilliant corporate attorney, Valerie, had discreetly handed him a shiny silver flash drive and $500 in crisp cash with very specific technical instructions. I gave the young technician a single, sharp, confident nod instantly. The technician immediately flipped a heavy switch on his control board, and the bright golden chandeliers quickly dimmed completely down to night. The wealthy guests let out confused murmurs as the room was plunged into dark, dramatic shadows instantly. Suddenly, a massive mechanical whirring sound echoed from the high ceiling directly behind me loudly. A giant white projector screen slowly rolled down from the ceiling, stopping perfectly directly behind the wooden stage. Susan let out a loud, terrified shriek and completely ran off the side of the stage, hiding in the dark shadows near the exit doors. I simply stood my ground, entirely bathed in the bright white light of the digital projector, completely ready for total, ultimate financial destruction right now. The giant blank screen flickered rapidly for a brief second before the highly anticipated digital presentation finally began. I did not need to turn around to look at the massive screen because I already knew exactly what was currently displayed brightly. I watched the horrible reflection of the bright digital light hit the terrified faces of the massive wealthy crowd. The collective reaction was absolutely incredibly instantaneous and violently explosive entirely. Several older wealthy women physically covered their shocked open mouths with their expensive manicured hands. The wealthy men stared at the screen with wide eyes, completely, totally, absolutely stunned. I raised the microphone back up to my lips, completely cutting through their loud, shocked gasps entirely. The very first document flashing on the giant screen behind me is the official catering and venue rental contract for this exact lavish party tonight, I announced loudly. You will quickly notice the very large red stamp placed aggressively across the bottom of the invoice, clearly. It is stamped completely declined by the primary banking institution forever. The massive $50,000 deposit required to host this incredibly beautiful high society gala has absolutely not been paid to this luxury hotel at all. I took a slow, deeply satisfying breath and continued my public execution without a single ounce of human mercy today. The hotel management was incredibly generous to allow this beautiful party to begin tonight, based entirely on the false, empty promises made by my son Marcus. I explained clearly. He assured the hotel director that the massive wire transfer would easily clear the banking system by 5 o'clock this afternoon. But as you can all clearly see on the massive screen, his corporate bank accounts are entirely frozen completely because he currently possesses absolutely zero real liquid financial assets today. Marcus let out a loud, miserable groan and physically completely collapsed against the heavy wooden bar, totally unable to support his own body weight anymore. Chloe stared at the massive screen in absolute horrific disbelief, completely forgetting to hold her fake pregnant stomach. The wealthy guests violently turned their angry, judgmental faces directly toward the golden couple, realizing they were currently drinking free champagne stolen from the hotel. The massive, shiny lie was finally completely, permanently dead. I smiled a very cold, dark smile, completely knowing the massive declined catering bill was only the very first piece of absolute destruction. The massive ballroom remained entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the declined catering invoice glowing brightly on the projector screen behind me. Marcus stared at the red declined stamp with completely hollow, empty eyes. But the declined invoice was merely the gentle opening act of my beautiful symphony of absolute destruction today. I took a slow, confident step toward the edge of the wooden stage, looking directly down at Chloe, who was still desperately clutching her fake stomach. "You claimed you were carrying my first grandchild," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence like a sharp knife. I gave a quick, sharp nod to the young audiovisual technician standing perfectly still in the dark back corner. The giant screen flickered brightly and displayed a completely blank medical record document retrieved directly from her personal primary care physician yesterday. "Your own private doctor confirms you possess absolutely zero active pregnancies right now," I announced loudly, watching her pale face turn an ugly shade of completely terrified white. "You shamelessly used a highly sacred, innocent life as a cheap, manipulative tool to desperately steal more money from my corporate empire, completely destroying your own false innocence entirely forever." The massive crowd let out a collective horrified gasp, staring at the woman who was just accepting expensive baby gifts merely 10 minutes ago. Chloe let out a loud, pathetic sob and dropped her hands from her flat stomach, quickly stepping away from Marcus. The wealthy women who had just warmly congratulated her now glared at her with pure, absolute disgust. I did not give them any time to recover from the massive shock before I signaled the young technician again. The blank medical document vanished, completely replaced by a massive, highly official federal government tax notice immediately right now. I looked directly at my highly arrogant son, who was still leaning heavily against the open hotel bar, breathing incredibly fast. Marcus, you successfully convinced my very jealous sister Denise to illegally transfer the legal operating rights of my entire restaurant chain directly into your name last month, I said loudly. You truly believed you had completely stolen my entire massive business empire right out from under me. But you completely failed to realize that I legally separated all the highly valuable commercial real estate property from the main operating business entity many long years ago to perfectly protect myself. I proudly gestured toward the massive screen displaying the terrifying red federal document for everyone to clearly see. What you successfully stole from me was nothing more than an entirely empty, hollow corporate shell, I declared powerfully. And that completely empty shell unfortunately carries a massive secret federal tax debt created entirely by your beloved Aunt Denise and her terrible illegal accounting practices 5 years ago. I boldly pointed my finger directly at Marcus, who looked completely ready to physically vomit right there on the expensive hotel carpet. Please loudly enjoy the restaurant, Marcus, because you totally own it today. The Internal Revenue Service will permanently seize the entire business tomorrow morning, completely seizing all associated bank accounts. Immediately, I said, my voice entirely devoid of any pity. You are solely officially responsible for the entire $3 million tax lien sitting brightly on that screen behind me. My older sister Denise let out a highly panicked scream from the back corner of the grand ballroom, completely dropping her crystal champagne glass onto the hard floor. The expensive glass shattered loudly, completely breaking the heavy silence as she quickly realized her own criminal financial fraud was fully exposed instantly today. I gave another sharp nod to the technician, and the massive screen flickered brightly once again. This time it prominently displayed the highly official Government Environmental Hazard Report, perfectly detailing the exact historic location of the massive South Lot commercial property. Marcus was breathing so incredibly fast, I genuinely thought he was going to entirely faint right in front of the massive, shocked audience. You arrogantly bragged to the entire world about purchasing the beautiful South Lot property, using the highly unstable restaurant company as your primary collateral for a massive, dangerous loan, I stated, staring directly into his eyes. You absolutely failed to perform even the most basic, standard legal research before completely signing your life away to highly dangerous criminal loan sharks entirely. The massive South Lot is officially a city-condemned toxic waste dump entirely poisoned by an old, huge chemical manufacturing plant many decades ago. You cannot legally build a luxury shopping plaza or a fancy residential development on deeply poisoned dirt, I loudly explained, watching the sheer terrifying reality finally hit his empty brain. It is entirely illegal to dig even a single shallow hole on that totally useless, pathetic, massive, empty property completely today. I pointed directly at the terrified, sweating man who used to call himself my very proud son. You currently owe $2 million to incredibly highly violent loan sharks for a totally worthless literal landfill, I announced loudly, my voice absolutely dominating the entirely silent ballroom easily. Those extremely dangerous criminals will absolutely realize tomorrow morning that your collateral is entirely worthless and deeply buried in federal debt entirely. And when they finally perfectly realize you completely scammed them, they will absolutely come looking directly for you violently, Marcus, to fully successfully collect their heavy, huge financial debt completely today. And perhaps the absolute most perfectly hilarious part of your massive real estate failure is the highly secretive identity of the completely anonymous corporate seller. I continued smoothly pacing the large stage. You happily, blindly wired $2 million in incredibly dirty, dangerous cash directly into my personal hidden holding company without ever checking the final legal names. I successfully legally sold my entirely worthless poisoned dirt directly to my highly ignorant son for a totally massive, incredible, pure financial profit, entirely, completely enriching my own massive, vast fortune, while perfectly sealing your incredibly terrible, pathetic, huge doom forever today. Chloe let out a completely massive, horrifying shriek and aggressively tore the expensive diamond wedding ring directly off her trembling finger instantly. She violently threw the incredibly heavy gold ring directly at the terrified chest of her completely broken, completely bankrupt husband, loudly hitting him hard. "You lied entirely to me!" Chloe screamed, her loud voice breaking completely into absolute, huge, highly hysterical, loud panic right now. "You are absolutely nothing but a totally worthless, broke, pathetic, huge liar, completely dragging me directly down into your massive, huge, incredibly dirty, terrifying financial, completely ruined, terrible deep pit today, absolutely forever." Suddenly, a very loud, sharp, incredibly desperate voice entirely shattered the massive screaming chaos happening down perfectly on the ballroom floor. "You are completely crazy!" "Vivian," a loud, deeply unhinged voice violently screamed directly from the very dark back corner of the large room. Susan came running totally out of the deep, dark shadows, wearing her entirely ridiculous gold gown and aggressively pointing a totally shaking finger at my calm, completely, perfectly composed face. "You fabricated absolutely every single terrible thing on that massive fake screen strictly to cruelly, deeply embarrass my wonderful, innocent, beautiful daughter completely, perfectly today, forever." She stood completely shaking, with absolute fury, furiously insisting that her own family possessed massive, huge, infinite generations of incredible, old, wealthy, elite money, totally untouched by my completely vicious, ugly inner-city lies tonight entirely. The massive crowd of 200 extremely wealthy guests murmured very loudly, completely entirely unsure of who exactly they should completely truly believe right now in this massively, completely chaotic, highly confusing, very wild, tense moment. I did not yell back at the perfectly, deeply terrified, sweating, heavily desperate, absolutely pathetic woman screaming right in my face loudly, right, absolutely perfectly there entirely today. I simply smiled, an incredibly massive, completely cold, beautiful smile, perfectly looking completely down upon her, totally broken, truly fake, absolutely destroyed, entirely false, pathetic, small, empty, weak existence, entirely today. "You are completely crazy, Vivian," she loudly screamed completely over and perfectly over again, entirely pointing her shaking finger directly at my chest, totally breathing extremely heavily. I completely, totally ignored her pathetic, desperate, tiny little screaming, completely raising the perfectly heavy metal microphone, absolutely directly, perfectly toward my highly confident lips, completely ready to, perfectly, entirely, successfully, securely, finally, deeply, totally, completely, thoroughly, end everything, perfectly today now. I gave one final nod to the young technician, standing quietly in the back corner of the grand ballroom. The massive screen flickered brightly for the very last time, replacing the toxic waste property report with a brand new, terrifying, highly official legal document. The massive crowd of extremely wealthy guests let out the loudest, most incredibly horrified gasp of the entire completely chaotic evening. The final slide clearly proudly displayed an absolutely legitimate, active federal Texas arrest warrant for Sarah Jenkins, totally exposing the completely fake Susan and her entirely fraudulent, pathetic, miserable, broke, desperate lying life completely forever. The massive ballroom remained completely frozen as the bright digital projector illuminated the terrifying Texas arrest warrant for Sarah Jenkins high above the stage. Susan stopped screaming instantly as her true identity was finally exposed to the wealthy crowd. The heavy silence was suddenly shattered by the loud sound of the grand ballroom doors swinging violently open. Everyone turned their heads simultaneously to see 4 uniformed police officers marching confidently onto the expensive carpet. Their heavy black boots thudded loudly against the floor as they ignored the shocked guests and walked directly toward the illuminated wooden stage where I stood. The lead police officer kept his stern eyes locked on the ridiculous gold gown worn by the desperate grifter hiding in the shadows. Susan tried to slowly back away toward the emergency exit, but 2 officers quickly flanked her, blocking her only escape route entirely. "Sarah Jenkins, you are under official arrest for multiple counts of felony wire fraud and grand larceny," the lead officer announced loudly, his deep voice carrying easily across the silent room. He grabbed her trembling right arm and firmly pulled it behind her back, ignoring her sudden tears and heavy fake sobbing completely. "You cannot do this to me!" Susan cried loudly, struggling weakly against the strong officers as they pulled her other arm backward. She looked desperately out at the massive crowd of wealthy socialites, hoping someone would boldly step forward to defend her completely fake honor tonight. But the elite guests simply stared at her with pure absolute disgust, entirely offended that a wanted criminal had successfully infiltrated their highly exclusive ranks. The cold steel handcuffs clicked loudly around her wrists, trapping the fake socialite permanently. The bright silver metal looked completely ridiculous against the cheap fabric of her dress. The officers began marching her firmly down the center aisle of the beautiful ballroom, forcing her to walk the long, humiliating path directly through her former friends. Susan kept her head bowed completely, unable to look at the disgusted faces staring fiercely at her completely ruined existence. I stood perfectly still on the elevated stage, watching the brilliant, absolute end of her highly pathetic, massive fraud. I did not feel a single ounce of human pity for her completely broken, miserable life. She had eagerly tried to completely destroy my family, so she entirely deserved her dark fate today. As the grand doors closed heavily behind the disgraced criminal, the remaining energy in the massive room suddenly violently shifted entirely toward my son and his lying wife. Chloe was breathing incredibly fast, perfectly realizing the absolute terrifying magnitude of her brand-new miserable reality entirely today. She looked directly at Marcus, who was still completely slumped against the wooden bar, looking totally destroyed and completely pathetic. Chloe finally perfectly understood that her husband possessed absolutely zero actual wealth and was officially chained to millions of dollars in highly dangerous federal tax debt and totally illegal, toxic loan shark money. "You have absolutely nothing," Chloe whispered loudly, her highly panicked voice completely carrying across the deeply silent room. "You are completely bankrupt and entirely worthless right now today, forever." She reached up with her violently trembling hands and aggressively grabbed the heavy, expensive diamond necklace resting beautifully around her neck. She forcefully yanked the thick silver chain, completely breaking the clasp, and threw the expensive jewelry directly onto the floor. She then quickly reached for her left hand and forcefully pulled the massive diamond wedding ring right off her finger, completely ignoring the highly shocked gasps from the massive crowd. Chloe aggressively stripped the heavy, expensive luxury watch from her wrist, completely discarding every single piece of fake wealth my son had desperately provided for her entirely. She violently threw the incredibly heavy gold ring and the expensive watch directly at the terrified chest of my completely broken son, hitting him hard. "You completely ruined my entire beautiful life, you pathetic, broke liar!" Chloe violently screamed, entirely dropping her sweet, innocent act forever. She turned around quickly and ran as fast as she possibly could, entirely out of the grand ballroom, completely leaving her totally ruined husband entirely behind, forever. Marcus did not even try to stop her or call her name, completely paralyzed by his massive total failure today. As the massive crowd continued to whisper loudly about the completely destroyed couple, I noticed a quick, sudden movement near the back corner of the grand ballroom. My older sister Denise was actively trying to slowly sneak out through the dark side exit, completely hoping to escape the massive, highly public reckoning happening tonight. She was clutching her small blue purse tightly against her chest, totally keeping her head completely down, hoping nobody would ever actually notice her cowardly escape. I was absolutely not going to let my highly treacherous sister easily escape the massive, terrible consequences of her completely illegal, highly selfish actions today. I quickly raised the wireless microphone perfectly back up to my lips, completely capturing the intense, full attention of the massive, highly shocked crowd once again. "Denise, please do not leave the beautiful party so incredibly early," I announced loudly, completely freezing her totally in her tracks near the dark wooden exit door. The entire wealthy crowd quickly turned around, completely staring directly at the incredibly terrified older woman wearing the completely overly sequined dress. Denise slowly turned her highly panicked, completely sweating face entirely back toward the bright main stage, looking absolutely perfectly deeply terrified right now today. "You need to stay right here and fully perfectly explain to all these completely wonderful wealthy people exactly how you successfully, entirely, fraudulently altered the highly official corporate accounting books. 5 long years ago, I loudly explained perfectly, ensuring my strong voice reached every single dark corner of the beautiful room. You completely illegally buried $3 million in massive federal tax debt, entirely putting my beautiful son directly, entirely, perfectly into absolute, massive, total ruin." Denise opened her mouth to speak, but absolutely no actual sound came out of her completely dry, totally panicked, highly terrified throat tonight. The wealthy guests gasped loudly, completely, entirely, stepping physically away from her, exactly like she was deeply covered in a highly toxic, dangerous poison. I completely perfectly watched my extremely jealous sister entirely, totally crumble under the massive, incredibly heavy weight of intense, absolute public, completely horrible humiliation entirely today. She totally, slowly, completely slid perfectly down the dark wooden wall, completely dropping her head into her shaking, completely, entirely sweaty, incredibly panicked, totally, highly terrified hands. I slowly and peacefully turned my calm, completely relaxed face back toward my highly devastated, entirely ruined, completely broken son today. Marcus was totally alone, surrounded directly by the shattered, completely broken pieces of his massive, pathetic, fake, incredibly stupid, entirely fake life. He looked directly at me with his totally empty, incredibly bloodshot, heavily weeping, highly pathetic, entirely sad, totally defeated, entirely desperate, deeply, incredibly highly, completely, incredibly highly, totally broken, entirely incredibly sad eyes forever today. His expensive black tailored tuxedo coat was completely wrinkled and heavily stained, deeply, with dark red expensive alcohol from his spilled drink. He completely, slowly, entirely dropped, heavily, perfectly, directly onto his incredibly sore, entirely, shaking completely, totally, weak, heavily bruised knees right on the expensive, totally soft, completely, highly beautiful, deeply rich, completely, incredibly, absolutely, entirely hotel carpet. "Mom, please help me." He loudly wept, entirely, begging me directly with his highly broken, completely, entirely shattered, totally pathetic voice today, right now. I just made a huge, massive, completely terrible, entirely horrible, perfectly awful, entirely, totally, completely, incredibly, deeply, profoundly huge, gigantic, massive, completely horrible, entirely terrible, extremely, absolutely bad decision. He sobbed extremely loudly forever today. I slowly walked down the short wooden steps of the main stage, entirely keeping my posture completely straight and highly confident. I smoothly approached the completely broken, weeping man on the carpet, entirely stopping just a few short inches away from his trembling body. The wealthy crowd watched in complete, perfect, highly silent, absolute, totally, entirely, deeply profound, completely respectful silence. I looked down at his tears, completely devoid of any warm maternal comfort, entirely refusing to properly offer him even a single drop of completely safe, entirely protective, completely beautiful, totally soft, highly wonderful, completely gentle, completely tender, entirely soft, completely human pity. You loudly demanded to completely, perfectly, permanently, absolutely, entirely, independently, totally, completely, perfectly, safely, completely successfully, absolutely, truly, entirely, beautifully, wonderfully, perfectly, independently, entirely independently, rule your own, highly massive, entirely, completely, incredibly huge, large, wonderful, beautiful, massive, wealthy, beautiful, huge, rich, incredibly massive, rich, highly successful, fully independent corporate empire, completely independently today. Forever, Marcus, I said quietly. But my voice carried clearly across the very silent, completely, totally dead, completely, perfectly quiet, entirely, absolutely, totally, highly, completely, incredibly, perfectly, deeply silent ballroom, entirely, completely forever today, perfectly right now. You successfully, deeply, absolutely, powerfully wanted to, deeply, absolutely, perfectly, entirely, totally, entirely, absolutely be the huge, massive boss completely today, forever. I continued entirely smoothly, perfectly, completely, entirely, beautifully looking down at his tears. Act exactly like one I firmly commanded, completely, entirely, completely, today completely. I turned around completely safely, peacefully, beautifully, entirely, elegantly, perfectly, powerfully, totally, flawlessly, entirely, quietly, walked, completely, directly, perfectly, gracefully, highly, successfully, fully, safely, completely, totally, independently, proudly, confidently, purely straight, completely, entirely, completely, independently, safely, fully, directly, entirely, purely, forever, directly out of the completely, incredibly silent ballroom, and never looked back at him, ever. 3 entire weeks had passed since the massive, disastrous hotel gala perfectly destroyed the fake empire my foolish son had desperately tried to build. The heavy dust had finally settled over the beautiful city of Atlanta, leaving nothing but the shattered, broken pieces of their pathetic, miserable lies. The cold, hard, absolute truth had completely swept through their incredibly fake lives, exactly like a massive, highly destructive, violent hurricane, completely tearing apart everything they had falsely claimed to own. Susan was no longer wearing her ridiculous cheap gold ball gowns or drinking expensive free champagne in luxury penthouses today. She was currently sitting inside a very cold, damp, incredibly dark federal prison cell located deep in the unforgiving state of Texas. The federal judges had entirely denied her any possible chance of expensive legal bail, labeling her a massive, extreme flight risk. She was permanently surrounded by cold, hard steel bars and highly dangerous, violent inmates forever. Her fake aristocratic transatlantic accent was completely gone, entirely replaced by the deeply terrified, highly desperate weeping of a broken, pathetic serial grifter, entirely facing decades of federal prison time. She had successfully scammed her very last innocent victim, completely securing her highly miserable, lonely, dark, pathetic doom forever today. My extremely jealous, bitter older sister Denise was facing her own completely massive, entirely destructive, deeply terrifying personal nightmare entirely right now. The federal government Internal Revenue Service had aggressively, violently seized absolutely every single one of her private personal bank accounts, entirely freezing all her highly cherished hidden money instantly. They were actively conducting a massive, highly aggressive, deep federal audit of her entire miserable, pathetic financial history. They were exposing every single highly illegal, incredibly terrible, fraudulent, entirely bad, deeply horrible accounting trick she had ever committed. The incredibly massive, heavy shame was entirely, totally, completely, deeply unbearable for her highly arrogant, fake socialite ego today. She was forced to entirely, completely, absolutely sell her beloved townhouse, entirely, desperately, absolutely pay her massive legal fees. The wealthy women at the church entirely, permanently, completely, totally ignored her, entirely acting like she was completely, entirely, completely dead forever today. Chloe had completely, totally, entirely, absolutely vanished, entirely into the dark, cold, quiet, lonely, completely empty night, exactly like a highly terrified, cowardly, small, completely pathetic, weak, frightened little ghost. The exact very second she completely realized that my son Marcus possessed absolutely zero real, actual, massive wealth, she quickly, aggressively, violently, desperately, entirely packed her bags. She grabbed her fake designer, incredibly, highly cheap, terrible, extremely ugly, incredibly, completely awful, entirely bad, completely fake bags. She abandoned her entirely fake, extremely, completely, totally fabricated, absolutely massive, highly, deeply, completely, incredibly ridiculous fake pregnancy, completely leaving absolutely no forwarding address or any tiny note, entirely, completely, totally whatsoever. She completely changed her phone number and totally, completely, entirely, absolutely disappeared from the entire beautiful state of Georgia, completely, entirely, absolutely, forever today. She completely, totally, absolutely, perfectly left Marcus entirely, completely alone to completely directly face the incredibly, highly violent, dangerous, angry, criminal loan sharks, totally, completely, entirely all by himself today. Marcus had entirely, completely, successfully secured a massive $2 million loan from highly, extremely, deeply, incredibly terrible, entirely, completely, entirely, incredibly dangerous, ruthless, highly violent men using entirely fake, worthless corporate collateral today. Those incredibly dangerous, violent men had completely, quickly, entirely found him, entirely, directly, immediately, quickly, demanding their incredibly massive, deeply huge, entirely, completely heavy, completely missing money today. They entirely, completely, physically dragged him completely, deeply, violently, thoroughly, absolutely, roughly, strictly, entirely, immediately, directly outside, and entirely, fully, absolutely, incredibly, violently, completely explained the highly, extremely, totally, completely, incredibly awful, absolutely, totally, entirely, highly deadly, completely dangerous, completely highly terrible, severe consequences of entirely, completely, totally, entirely stealing their highly dirty, completely illegal, absolutely criminal, totally, entirely cash forever today. He was completely, entirely, officially, totally, absolutely, perfectly, fully bankrupt, completely and totally, thoroughly, highly, deeply, absolutely, completely, massively, completely, entirely broken. I drove my extremely beautiful, completely, highly expensive, entirely pristine luxury sedan, completely, entirely, perfectly, smoothly down a very dirty, entirely, completely dark, highly dangerous, poorly lit, narrow alleyway, deep inside the extremely, entirely poor, absolutely, completely, deeply rough, totally terrible, completely bad, entirely, absolutely, entirely poor, completely dirty side of the large city today. I completely, smoothly, entirely, quietly, perfectly successfully parked my beautiful, entirely shiny dark car, perfectly safely, entirely directly outside, a completely, entirely, terribly, deeply awful, extremely greasy, absolutely, completely, deeply disgusting, completely cheap, highly terrible, absolutely dirty, entirely, completely, incredibly bad, incredibly cheap, small local diner. I calmly, slowly, absolutely, entirely, carefully, gracefully, completely, perfectly, totally peacefully, beautifully, entirely opened my heavy, entirely solid car door and smoothly, beautifully, absolutely, elegantly stepped, completely, directly, entirely, perfectly, safely out into the warm, thick, highly, completely, entirely heavy, absolutely humid, perfectly, completely warm, humid southern evening air, completely, entirely, gracefully today. I was entirely, completely, beautifully, perfectly, completely, beautifully, highly, successfully dressed in a highly, beautifully, extremely, entirely, completely, absolutely, totally, perfectly, beautifully, tailored, deeply, incredibly, entirely soft, completely, totally, purely elegant, entirely, deeply dark, highly beautiful, incredibly, completely, deeply stunning navy blue, perfectly beautiful, completely, highly expensive, absolutely gorgeous, entirely beautiful, entirely gorgeous pantsuit. I walked entirely calmly, entirely, totally peacefully, completely, directly, smoothly, inside the extremely, incredibly, highly smelly, totally, terribly, extremely, completely, incredibly, deeply, entirely greasy, incredibly, totally dirty, completely, absolutely bad, small, extremely terrible, deeply, completely horrible, utterly terrible, entirely, highly cheap diner, completely, entirely, slowly, entirely, completely today, perfectly today, safely today. My highly arrogant, fully confident, totally entitled, absolutely, completely, totally, terribly foolish, deeply, incredibly, completely, totally, utterly, totally, deeply, incredibly deeply, entirely broken son was completely, entirely, directly, fully, absolutely, immediately, successfully, directly working, entirely, perfectly, completely, directly, entirely, behind the completely, absolutely, extremely dirty, highly, completely terrible, entirely greasy, purely, completely badly, completely, highly, horribly, deeply, extremely dirty, bad, deeply, cheap kitchen counter today, completely right, entirely now, perfectly, completely. He was wearing a deeply, entirely, incredibly, absolutely, completely, absolutely, fully, extremely terrible, deeply, entirely, perfectly, fully, extremely, absolutely, entirely, deeply, completely, terribly, badly, completely, absolutely, deeply, extremely badly, fully, incredibly, extremely deeply, badly, deeply, completely, terribly, heavily, absolutely, highly, heavily, deeply, horribly, deeply, stained, highly ugly, purely cheap, completely wet, highly gray, completely, totally, extremely bad, totally, utterly terrible, awful, entirely disgusting uniform, totally right, perfectly, absolutely now. His hands were completely, utterly, entirely, perfectly, absolutely, perfectly, absolutely, deeply, completely, utterly, deeply, totally, fully, directly, intensely, fully, entirely, deeply, terribly, highly, terribly raw, entirely bleeding, completely red, completely, absolutely, completely, fully, completely wet, absolutely, perfectly, totally, completely, entirely, perfectly, absolutely, completely, absolutely, deeply, incredibly sore, totally, completely, right, entirely, completely, perfectly, immediately, directly, perfectly, safely, absolutely, perfectly, right, directly now, perfectly, safely, right, successfully, safely, exactly, today. He was absolutely, completely, thoroughly, completely, officially, successfully, absolutely successfully, completely, absolutely, entirely successfully, perfectly successfully, absolutely perfectly, directly, totally, fully, totally, absolutely perfectly, directly, totally scrubbing, absolutely, utterly, entirely, terribly, deeply, totally, absolutely, perfectly, fully, extremely, massive, completely, highly, fully, highly, completely, heavy, utterly, terribly, deeply, completely, terribly, absolutely, perfectly, totally, highly, completely, entirely, heavy, deeply, entirely, terrible, purely, badly, completely, totally, absolutely, totally, heavily, totally, utterly, perfectly, absolutely, Completely, fully, terrible. Pans, perfectly. Immediately, correctly. Currently, completely successfully. Perfectly, thoroughly, exactly, right. Precisely, absolutely, entirely, effectively, thoroughly, completely today. He slowly looked up from the dirty, greasy water and stared directly at me. His eyes were completely red and swollen from crying endlessly. He looked exactly like a completely broken man who had finally realized the massive, terrifying magnitude of his incredibly foolish, terrible decisions. He opened his mouth to speak, but I completely held up my right hand to entirely silence him immediately. "I did not come here to listen to your completely pathetic apologies, Marcus," I said quietly but firmly. "I did not come here to save you from the massive, dangerous consequences of your entirely terrible, illegal actions." I reached inside my expensive navy blue designer purse and slowly pulled out a small black velvet box. I opened the small soft box and gently placed it directly on the extremely dirty, wet silver metal counter right in front of him. Inside the dark box was the incredibly heavy, solid gold watch that had belonged entirely to his deeply beloved late father. Marcus stared at the gold watch, frozen in absolute shock. I looked deeply into his terrified, broken eyes. "You spent your life trying to steal the wealth your father and I built," I explained. "You entirely wanted to be the massive, completely powerful, completely highly successful, highly completely wealthy boss today. True wealth is completely earned." "Marcus, not stolen," I told him calmly. I turned around and walked out of the terrible diner, stepping back into my beautiful, peaceful, entirely, completely perfect life. Exactly 1 full year has completely passed since that incredibly chaotic and explosive night in the Grand Hotel ballroom. Today, the bright, warm, tropical sun is shining down perfectly on my completely relaxed and incredibly peaceful face. I am currently lounging comfortably on the massive open deck of a beautiful luxury yacht, gently cruising through the clear, crystal blue waters of the gorgeous Caribbean Sea. The gentle, warm ocean breeze is softly blowing through my natural hair, and the highly refreshing, salty air fills my lungs completely with every single deep, slow breath I take. There are absolutely no demanding phone calls ringing loudly in my ears today. There are absolutely no desperate, ungrateful family members aggressively demanding my hard-earned money or creating toxic drama in my personal life. There is only the beautiful, calming sound of the gentle ocean waves softly crashing against the sleek white side of the massive, gorgeous boat, and the highly joyful sound of genuine, warm laughter echoing perfectly around me right now. I am wearing a stunning, flowing white silk resort dress that beautifully complements my rich, dark skin entirely perfectly. I am holding a tall crystal glass filled with expensive chilled champagne and fresh tropical fruit juice, entirely enjoying the absolute peak of total, complete, ultimate luxury. Sitting completely relaxed right across from me on the comfortable plush white leather seating area is my incredibly brilliant corporate attorney and deeply loyal best friend, Valerie. She is wearing a huge, beautiful woven sun hat and stylish, dark designer sunglasses, sipping her own cold, refreshing drink perfectly today. Valerie is not just my highly effective legal counsel anymore. She is my true, authentic, chosen family. We are surrounded by a wonderful, carefully selected small group of highly supportive, deeply genuine, beautiful friends who have consistently proven their absolute loyalty and deep, authentic love over many long, hard years. These are the wonderful, beautiful, strong women who truly stood by my side when I was completely exhausted, stressed, and desperately trying to build my massive corporate empire from scratch many long decades ago. They never asked me for unearned handouts. They never expected me to blindly fund their personal, highly expensive, luxurious lifestyles. They supported me unconditionally and celebrated my massive victories perfectly, purely, genuinely, without a single ounce of dark, bitter, toxic, terrible jealousy. Blood may automatically make you legally related to someone by birth, but absolute, deep, profound, unquestionable loyalty is what truly makes someone your real, authentic family forever. For my entire adult life, I mistakenly believed that my ultimate heavy burden was to endlessly financially support the highly ungrateful people who happened to accidentally share my genetic bloodline. I constantly sacrificed my own personal mental peace, completely ignoring my own deep, severe, absolute exhaustion just to keep the highly toxic peace at the traditional Sunday dinner table. I cooked massive, expensive, heavy traditional meals, entirely trying to warmly gather a highly fractured, entirely broken, deeply ungrateful family together successfully. I tolerated massive, horrible, deeply offensive tiny microaggressions and blatant, terrible disrespect from a completely fake, extremely pathetic socialite, hoping my foolish, arrogant son would eventually, successfully, miraculously, totally mature into a strong, highly responsible, highly respectable, wonderful grown man. I spent years pouring my hard-earned wealth into a bottomless pit of absolute entitlement. I bought luxury cars and funded expensive vacations, hoping that generosity would eventually magically transform into genuine deep respect and authentic love. But I finally completely successfully totally realized that you absolutely cannot deeply love someone enough to instantly miraculously cure their deeply rooted toxic, horrible, terrible, completely entitled, deep arrogant sickness. The massive total legal aftermath of that explosive, highly destructive, incredibly public, beautiful grand gala was entirely, perfectly, swiftly decisive. My deeply brilliant attorney Valerie had perfectly successfully legally protected every single valuable commercial real estate asset and highly profitable corporate restaurant location long before the massive financial storm even officially hit the local city news. The highly dangerous, highly aggressive criminal loan sharks completely successfully quickly took over the completely worthless, totally empty, deeply, heavily debt-ridden, hollow corporate shell company. My completely foolish, entirely broken, arrogant son had totally illegally stolen from me. They completely seized his least expensive foreign luxury cars and violently, aggressively emptied his tiny personal bank accounts completely, entirely, flawlessly, perfectly today. The extremely powerful, highly relentless, deeply unforgiving Federal Internal Revenue Service agents absolutely successfully heavily audited my incredibly deeply jealous, highly bitter, entirely horrible, terrible, completely fake sister Denise, perfectly, exactly as I completely, flawlessly, safely predicted. She was successfully, permanently, completely, legally, entirely, heavily, deeply stripped of all her completely false, highly unearned, fake wealthy, highly arrogant social standing entirely forever today. And then there is the completely, incredibly, truly, entirely pathetic, deeply, absolutely miserable, completely false, fake socialite Susan. Or should I correctly, specifically, formally, accurately, absolutely, completely call her by her highly authentic, highly legal, totally real, entirely criminal name Sarah Jenkins, entirely today. She is currently, officially, permanently, deeply, totally, entirely, heavily, completely, safely residing in a highly secure, entirely cold, incredibly dark, highly uncomfortable, extremely severe, highly restrictive, completely dangerous, deeply isolated federal correctional prison facility located completely, entirely, totally deep inside the incredibly hot, absolutely flat, incredibly dusty, completely dry, deeply harsh state of Texas, completely today, right now, forever. She will spend the absolute total remaining heavy, long, dark, lonely, deeply, horrible, completely miserable, totally sad, dark, absolutely incredibly, deeply difficult, terrible, harsh decades of her completely, highly, totally miserable life, completely, utterly, entirely surrounded, perfectly, permanently, deeply, entirely, forever, totally, securely, completely, strictly by solid, completely, highly unyielding, thick, deeply cold, totally, incredibly deep, perfectly, incredibly, completely, totally, entirely, absolute, completely heavy, thick steel bars. Thick steel. Her terrible, horrible, absolutely fake transatlantic accent, completely, totally, incredibly, entirely, absolutely, perfectly, quickly, completely, permanently, completely, entirely, totally, rapidly, completely, incredibly swiftly, entirely, permanently, perfectly vanished, completely successfully, the exact, immediate, absolute, highly fast, precise, entirely, completely exact moment, the massive, heavy, completely, totally thick, heavy, entirely thick, extremely solid, incredibly thick steel, incredibly heavy, cold, deeply, completely secure, totally secure, prison bars, completely, officially, loudly, totally, completely, safely slammed, entirely securely, absolutely completely, permanently, totally securely, entirely, loudly, heavily, entirely, completely successfully, securely, tightly shut, completely, deeply, tightly, securely, completely, forever, totally behind her. Chloe, completely, totally, absolutely successfully, entirely, fully, perfectly, highly, immediately, safely, successfully, completely, permanently, completely, rapidly, absolutely, rapidly, entirely, highly, quickly, entirely, rapidly, entirely fled the completely, absolutely, totally, entirely beautiful, completely, incredibly beautiful, highly gorgeous, extremely, entirely, absolutely gorgeous, completely, huge, massive, entire state of Georgia, completely, absolutely, perfectly today. She totally, utterly, absolutely, permanently, safely, flawlessly, safely, successfully, perfectly, smoothly, easily, highly, totally, heavily, rapidly changed her, incredibly, totally, completely private, entirely, completely personal, entirely, fully personal, totally, strictly, entirely, highly, entirely private, perfectly, strictly, deeply, purely cellular, mobile. Cell phone number, completely successfully, perfectly, absolutely, totally, today, perfectly, right now. She successfully, absolutely, flawlessly, highly, thoroughly, purely, entirely, successfully, flawlessly, left my incredibly, deeply, fully, entirely, terribly, highly, totally, utterly, highly, heavily, completely, totally, completely, entirely, terribly, incredibly, extremely badly, severely, totally, deeply, heavily, thoroughly, massively, incredibly, horribly, incredibly, deeply, completely, entirely, fully, completely, thoroughly, profoundly, thoroughly, heavily broken, completely, foolish, arrogant, completely, totally, highly, completely, deeply, entirely, extremely, utterly, thoroughly, profoundly, severely, deeply, totally, deeply, ruined, completely, entirely, deeply, extremely, totally, incredibly. Son Marcus, entirely, completely, fully, absolutely, purely, flawlessly, smoothly, flawlessly, safely alone, entirely safely today, to deeply, absolutely, cleanly, flawlessly, fully, thoroughly, truly, totally, fully, entirely face the massive financial ruin alone. He now washes dishes at a deeply greasy, completely, entirely, fully, utterly, incredibly cheap, local, terrible, horrible, terrible, deeply small, local, tiny diner, entirely, perfectly, forever, securely, fully, securely, right, completely, directly, deeply, thoroughly, utterly, badly, right, entirely, absolutely, directly today, perfectly, right now. The boy who wore tailored suits and completely laughed at his own mother now officially spends every single waking hour completely scrubbing heavy dirty pots and pans, perfectly trying to slowly pay off massive dangerous debt entirely, completely, forever. I sip my delicious cold champagne and look out at the beautiful, endless horizon. The heavy weight I carried for decades is completely gone. They thought my silence was weakness. They forgot that the woman who builds the empire is the only one who knows where the dynamite is buried. Protect your peace, secure your legacy, and never apologize for taking out the trash. If you absolutely loved hearing how I successfully protected my peace and destroyed a family of completely fake greedy grifters, let me know right now in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe today to join our beautiful, strong community, and share this video with anyone who needs a powerful, bold reminder to always confidently stand their ground and fiercely protect their own hard-earned empire completely forever today.